Vietnam, America's Betrayal and Treason. A 4-hour presentation of the evidence that America planned the Vietnamese War of 1964 to 1975 years in advance, for a reason not made public to the people of the United States until now. A presentation of Publius Production. Permission is granted to make copies of this presentation. This is Ralph Epperson, and I will be the one presenting this material on this DVD. For the sake of any dated material in this lecture, I'm making this DVD on the 9th of April 2010. What you are about to see is an update of a 3-hour VHS tape that I wrote and produced in 1992 and put into my catalog of materials I have for sale. And as far as I was able to tell, this 3-hour presentation was the most complete and thoroughly documented study of the war in Vietnam that I was able to find. Let me point out that this is a PowerPoint presentation and that this computer program will not let me speak during a slide change. So it might sound a little disjointed, but that is the way this program works. The first question I would like to answer is this one. Why am I making a DVD about a war that ended in 1975? And the answer is because I want to set the record straight for the historians of the future. Because what I'm about to document has never been told before as far as I'm able to determine. I am reminded of the quote attributed to the poet and philosopher George Santayana, who wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And the reason America is currently fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan is because America has not remembered the past and we have repeated it. And I want this record to be saved for those historians who follow after me. Now I must warn you, I'm certain that some of what I will discuss is capable of offending you, and I am sorry for that. But I am reminded of what Patrick Henry, one of this nation's great founding fathers, said about the truth back during the days prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July the 4th, 1776. He spoke about why we should want to be exposed to the truth. So these are some of the things he said on March the 23rd, 1775. We are apt to shut our eyes against a painful truth and listen to that siren till she transforms us into beasts. For my part, whatever anguish of spirit it might cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and to provide for it. So if you are offended by the truth, may I humbly suggest that you turn this DVD off, because much of the material I will be discussing is, as Patrick Henry termed it, a painful truth. I would like all of you to please consider yourself on a jury, and as jury members you are asked to be as impartial as you can, forgetting any previous thoughts you might have about the war before you reach a verdict. Because what you are going to hear and see will be evidence that the American government actually knowingly murdered their own fighting forces in Vietnam. That is certainly not a popular or pleasant thought to hold. And if you are open to the evidence that I will present, this might be the first time you have ever heard the truth about this war and why our nation was involved in that war in Vietnam. This is a slide photograph of the magnificent Grand Canyon in my home state of Arizona. I'm going to present over 1,200 other slide photographs of the story of the war in Vietnam. What you are about to view is like a puzzle made up of many individual pieces. And there will be parts of it that you will not agree with. But I would like to urge you to discard those parts you have a problem with accepting. And when you do, you will still see that the picture is of the Grand Canyon, even though there are parts of the picture missing. And even with parts of the story of the war in Vietnam missing, you will still have enough to agree with me that there is a real concealed story in the details of the war in Vietnam. And I believe that even with the remaining evidence, it is still clear enough to see that the American government murdered 58,000 of America's fighting forces in Vietnam. There is simply no other explanation as to why these events happened. I am a graduate of the University of Arizona, but what I am covering today was not taught to me in college. I have had to self-study, and in the intervening 47 years since I started my research, I have learned that some of this world's history needs to be revised. I have discovered the existence of a 6,000-year-old conspiracy at work in the world as part of my study of what I call the conspiratorial view of history. This view holds that a conspiracy has planned the major events of the past for a specific reason that I hope to make clear during this presentation. What I was taught all the way through college was what I call the accidental view of history, which holds that no one knows why wars, depressions, and revolutions occur. They just do. I was actually paid by the state of Oregon to teach my views in a community college in Portland, and I have lectured in many states for many years. And I have authored 4 books on the subject. My first book was entitled The Unseen Hand, an Introduction to the Conspiratorial View of History. It was published in 1985 and is still being reprinted. In fact, it has been published in 6 European nations by publishers who contacted me for permission to publish it in their own language in their own respective nation. My second book is entitled The New World Order and is a well-documented examination of just what this phrase means to the future of the world. My third book is entitled Masonry, Conspiracy Against Christianity, and is an examination of the evidence from their own literature that worldwide Masonry has a, quote, true purpose, unquote, and that is simply the destruction of Christianity. My fourth book is entitled Jesse James, United States Senator, and it examines the evidence that Jesse James, America's most famous outlaw, was not murdered in 1882, but that he lived until 1951 under a variety of aliases. And that during the period of 1882 until 1951, when he died, he was a major figure in America's past. And with this introductory information, it is time for me to begin the study of America's betrayal and treason in the war in Vietnam. And a good place to start is in the definition of the word conspiracy. It is defined in a dictionary as a combination of people working in secret for an evil or unlawful purpose. Notice that their purpose must be both evil and secret. And the reason they operate in secrecy is because evil people with evil motives seek secrecy, and good people with good motives seek publicity. This conspiracy seeks secrecy because if the people became aware of their plans before they were brought into fruition, they would not be allowed to succeed. So if a conspiracy in America planned a war years in advance, they would obviously make their plans in secret because their plans were evil. Perhaps you might remember a bumper sticker that appeared during the Vietnamese War, which read, "Suppose they gave a war and nobody showed up." This is the reason that they did not tell us what their plans were for the Vietnamese War, because if they did, we would not have sent our family members to fight in it. And without soldiers, you cannot have much of a war. The second word we must define is the word murder. Murder is the taking of a life without a moral cause. Now, I'm not here to debate whether self-defense or capital punishment is a moral cause, but civilization demands that murder must have a moral cause to take the life of another. Each of us has been given the right to life by the God who created us. And the reason we punish murderers is because they have wrongfully taken another human's right to life. The God who created us gave us a written commandment when he spoke to Moses many centuries ago. That commandment is, "Thou shalt not murder." I am certain that some could take these words to mean that if they hired someone else to murder another, they could claim that they did not violate the commandment, the murderer did. But I believe that in this case, both of these individuals would be equally guilty of murder, and both should be punished. One way to murder someone is to create a war, send some soldiers in to fight it, and then send the weapons the enemy needs to kill those soldiers. This is murder as well, and it's precisely what happened in Vietnam. And I call this first-degree premeditated murder. If this presentation was a movie, it would be rated R because of excessive violence. I am going to specifically accuse Lyndon Johnson, President of the United States during the war years of 1964 to 1969, and Richard Nixon, President of the United States from 1969 to 1975 when the war ended, of first-degree premeditated murder. I am also going to accuse hundreds of congressmen and senators of the same crime, first-degree premeditated murder. And the journalists, reporters, and other members of the media who did not tell the American people the truth when they knew it to be true. And there is a reason for this. America's free press is not free. I'm also going to name other individuals, people involved in the war, but not involved with the crime of murder. In fact, 3 individuals ended the war years before it was supposed to end. I will tell you the story of how these men, not in government or the media, nor in the active military, brought the war to an end in 1973. All of this will be revealed later in other sections of this presentation. Now, why didn't Walter Cronkite or hundreds of others reporting on this war tell us about the intentional murder of America's fighting forces in Vietnam, and also what these 3 men did? And the answer is, as I've already said, because America's press is not free, and they are obligated to spread the lies told to them by those who committed our fighting forces to a war they were not allowed to win. Now, to understand the Vietnamese War, we must go back to the beginning. World War II was fought between the years of 1941 and 1945. And in this part of the world, called Southeast Asia, it was fought between the Japanese and the United States. The Vietnamese War was fought between the years of 1964 to 1975. The government of North Vietnam and a guerrilla army known as the Viet Cong fought against the South Vietnamese and the United States. So this was about 19 or 20 years ago, 20 years between the two wars. During World War II, the Japanese were occupying the area, and as the war was drawing to a close, they started withdrawing their troops back to Japan. And as they left the area, they abandoned tons of war-making materials. These weapons, ammunition, food supplies, medicine, etc., were gathered up by the Office of Strategic Services, abbreviated to the OSS, and they turned them over to Ho Chi Minh, the leader of that guerrilla army later called the Viet Cong. Please remember this photograph of these two men for a reason I will discuss later. The American government knew that Ho had been educated in Moscow in Communist Russia and that he had been exiled to France, where in 1920 he became the first Vietnamese to join the French Communist Party. In 1930, he organized the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And in 1941, he created the communist-dominated Viet Cong. All of his background was known to the government of the United States prior to World War II. This is the book entitled Strange Ground, Americans in Vietnam from 1945 to 1975 by Harry Maurer. He quotes Kenneth Landon, a State Department officer who met Ho Chi Minh in 1946. Ho was a good communist. I had no doubt that if he dominated the political scene, it would be a communist country. This story was confirmed in this Parade magazine article that appeared in 1973 entitled Ho was an intelligence agent of the United States. That means he worked for us, American taxpayers. In this article, an American intelligence agent named Charles Fenn wrote that he recruited Ho in March of 1945 as World War II was ending. Fenn wrote, "We had a trusted agent whom we regularly supplied with weapons, radio equipment, operators, and medicine. All of it served to reinforce his position and status." The position that the United States was supporting this communist in the planning of a major revolution and war in Vietnam was confirmed by this Parade magazine article in June of 1982. Parade wrote that American General Philip Gallagher arrived in Vietnam in the summer of 1945 and established a warm rapport with Ho. This soon-to-be murderer of millions of Vietnamese, Americans, Laotians, and Cambodians became a close friend of the American general. The article continued. General Gallagher's speech at a rally in Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, in October of 1945, was broadcast over Viet Minh, later called the Viet Cong radio. In other words, the communists were telling the Vietnamese people that the American government was siding with the communists in a revolution that would start very shortly. This is the book entitled A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, who told us who another of these Americans was who assisted the communist Ho Chi Minh, and he says this on page 9. After the entry of the United States into World War II, Lieutenant Colonel Lucien Conien joined the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency called the CIA. He had landed in the area by parachute in 1945. Harry Maurer wrote this in his book, "The mission of the OSS was to train a guerrilla force." So the message was very clear. The United States government was backing Ho Chi Minh in a communist revolution and ultimately a war in Vietnam. 8 years later, in 1953, Dwight Eisenhower became President of the United States, and he started sending American military advisors into Vietnam. These men were not in Vietnam to fight the Viet Cong. They were there to train an army of South Vietnamese to fight the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army. And in 1960, the American people elected John Kennedy as President of the United States. Sometime later, President Kennedy learned of the plans of the CIA to create a war in Vietnam. And he planned on making a complete withdrawal of all American troops in Vietnam after his re-election in 1964. The fact that President Kennedy planned on withdrawing the troops has been confirmed by at least 6 different sources. I'd like to discuss 3 of these. This is Fletcher Prouty, a retired Air Force colonel who worked as a liaison between the CIA and President Kennedy. He's written a book entitled The Secret Team, in which he states that it was known in the administration that President Kennedy was going to withdraw all of the troops from Vietnam before the war started in earnest. The second source was Stuart Udall, the Secretary of the Interior in President Kennedy's administration. That is him to the left of the president. He was quoted as saying Kennedy's admirers say he was in the process of pulling back from Vietnam. The third source was former Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill of the House of Representatives. In January of 1992, he was a guest on the Larry King television talk program, and he said that President Kennedy was going to pull the troops out of Vietnam. So President Kennedy was committed to getting America out of a war that hadn't even started. But on November 22, 1963, President Kennedy traveled to Dallas, Texas, and was assassinated. This is the Los Angeles Times edition of November 23, 1963, the morning after the assassination. I have read over 52 books on the assassination, and I am totally convinced that elements inside 6 different organizations planned and then carried out the assassination of the president. Those 6 organizations are the CIA, the FBI, the Mafia, the Secret Service, the Dallas Police Department, and the Masonic Lodge. And the reason they conspired to assassinate the president was because he wanted to end a war that had been planned since at least 1945. And to start the process of the withdrawal of the troops from Vietnam, President Kennedy issued National Security Action Memorandum number 263, dated October the 11th, 1963, about 6 weeks before the assassination. The memorandum specifically ordered the withdrawal of 1,000 of the 16,500 troops initially. Upon the death of President Kennedy, Vice President Lyndon Johnson became President of the United States. This is the famous picture of the President being sworn into the presidency on the day of the assassination. That is Jackie Kennedy, President Kennedy's wife, to his left. Within 4 days of that event, President Johnson issued National Security Action Memorandum 273, canceling Kennedy's withdrawal plans. One could logically conclude that the reason President Kennedy was assassinated was because he wanted to end a war that had been planned by the government of the United States at least 18 years before, and that President Johnson wanted to carry out those plans. The next step in the coming war in Vietnam was the presidential election of 1964. President Johnson was seeking to be elected on his own right, and he ran against the Republican candidate for the presidency, Senator Barry Goldwater. The media made Senator Goldwater out to be a warmonger, meaning he was in favor of involving America in a war in Vietnam. And Senator Johnson was made out, Vice President, now President, was made out to be the peace candidate, meaning he wanted to keep us out of a war in Vietnam. I worked for Senator Goldwater in the 1964 campaign as a volunteer, and I was being warned that if I voted for Goldwater, we would be at war in Vietnam, within 6 months of his election. And sure enough, I voted for Barry Goldwater. And within 6 months of the election, we were at war in Vietnam. But the interesting thing about the election of 1964 was the fact that Goldwater was not elected president. Johnson was. During the campaign before the war started, President Johnson was promising the American people, we don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. We don't want to get tied down in the land war in Asia. So Johnson was making 3 promises with those statements. Number 1, no American boys would fight for Asian boys. Number 2, there would be no land war in Asia. And number 3, we would not get tied down in any war in Vietnam. But President Johnson had to know the reason President Kennedy was killed. These war plans had been made after World War II. Therefore, he had to know the war was coming. Therefore, he was lying to the American people. He knew he could not keep these promises. American boys would fight. He would get us into a land war, and he would get us tied down in a war that dragged on for at least 8 more years. The next thing that happened occurred in August of 1964 by an incident known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. The American people were told that 2 North Vietnamese patrol boats fired on 2 American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, the body of water just east of North Vietnam. But the interesting thing is that this attack never took place. It never happened. U.S. News and World Report carried an article in their July 23, 1984 edition entitled The Phantom Battle That Led to War. The article told the readers how America got into the war through a phony incident. In November of 1963, President Johnson told planners to develop a series of covert, meaning secret operations against North Vietnam to discourage its aggressive policies. On July 5, 1964, U.S. Admiral Grant Sharp, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, requested approval of an intelligence-gathering patrol along the North Vietnamese shoreline. The Joint Chiefs of Staff and civilian authorities promptly approved the request. So on July the 17th, 1964, the U.S. destroyer Maddox received orders to enter the Gulf of Tonkin. This is a close-up of the area. Vietnam is on the left and the Gulf of Tonkin is in the middle. The island off the right at about 3 o'clock is owned by the Communist nation of China. That makes the water between the 2 nations international waters, which means any nation may send ships into the area. And this is the area that the destroyer entered. On the night of August the 4th, 1964, the Maddox and another destroyer, the Turner Joy, radioed that they were under attack by at least 3 North Vietnamese PT boats. This is a book entitled In Love and War, written by Admiral Jim Stockdale, at the time a squadron leader on an aircraft carrier also near the Gulf of Tonkin. He heard the report, and he was the first American pilot over the area where the 2 destroyers were, and he heard the Maddox frantically report that the ship was under attack by 3 PT boats and that torpedoes were in the water and that the ship was engaging the enemy with his main battery. Life magazine of August 14, 1964, reported that the Maddox had avoided several torpedoes and had sunk one of the attacking craft. Newsweek magazine reported in its August 14, 1964 edition, torpedoes whipped by, some only 100 feet from the destroyer, and that a PT boat had burst into flames and that it had sunk. But the interesting thing is that the Gulf of Tonkin attack, as I've said, never happened. Admiral Stockdale reported in his book that nobody was shooting at our destroyers that night. No one American out there ever saw a PT boat. There was absolutely no gunfire except our own. None could have been there and not have been seen on such a black night. Admiral Sharp reported that the latest message from the destroyers indicated a little doubt on just exactly what went on. When Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later asked the Admiral, was there a possibility that no attack occurred? Sharp admitted, I would say that there is a slight possibility. Notice that Admiral Sharp was not saying that he knew with absolute certainty or that we had complete evidence that the attack had happened. He was saying that he had some doubts about whether the event had actually occurred. Finally, for those of you who have the ability to get on the internet, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara admits on a 3-minute, 34-second clip available on YouTube entitled Gulf of Tonkin, McNamara admits it didn't happen. And here's the reason the media went with the story that our destroyers had been attacked. This comes from the U.S. News and World Report article. Press stories and leaks from U.S. officials suggested that McNamara's 1964 testimony about the Gulf of Tonkin incidents was at best incomplete and at worst part of an elaborate, if improbable, conspiracy. I can presume that the reporter who wrote those words probably bit off his or her tongue when he or she wrote these words about this being evidence of a conspiracy, because the press generally does not believe that any conspiracy could exist in any governmental activity. So even though the evidence seemed to imply that a conspiracy existed in faking this incident, the only conclusion that could be drawn from the event was that there might be a conspiracy, and that makes this event improbable. The reporter didn't have the courage to follow up on this story, and this sort of reporting that there was a hidden agenda in the planning and waging of this war went on throughout the entirety of the war and even continues up to the day. And because of this, millions of people died in Vietnam and the surrounding countries. That is why I accuse the media in general of murder as well. They had the evidence that there was a conspiracy at work, and they did not tell the world the truth. A lot of people in the media saw direct evidence of a conspiracy at work, but they called it an improbable conspiracy and didn't believe it. 2 days later, after the alleged attack, President Johnson asked Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, giving him the permission to use retaliatory force against the North Vietnamese. The resolution was passed 416 to nothing in the House and 88 to 2 in the Senate. And Johnson signed the resolution. And we were at war in Vietnam that had been planned by this conspiracy behind the American government in at least 1945. The military advisors in Vietnam laid down their clipboards and grabbed their rifles. All because of an event that simply did not happen. So I asked a question in a 3-hour VHS lecture that I produced in 1992. Why did this conspiracy stage a phony attack? Please remember that we, the people, had voted for Lyndon Johnson, the peace candidate, in the election of 1964. And in fact, as I said, he promised us we would not go to war in Vietnam. And we elected him because we did not want the war, so we had to be tricked into it. So they staged a faked incident so that we would support their war plans made in at least 1945. But staging an incident to get America into a war that the American people did not want is not a new idea. It has been tried at least 2 times before. World War I was fought between the years of 1914 to 1918, and the United States did not enter the war until 1917. Woodrow Wilson was elected President of the United States in 1912, and he was seeking re-election in 1916 as a peace candidate. He was running on a statement that he had kept us out of the war, meaning between 1914 and 1916. President Wilson said this in 1916, "This is a government of the people, and this people is not going to choose war." But all the time he was declaring that he was a peace candidate, he was conspiring with at least 2 others to involve us in the war. One was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was his Assistant Secretary of the Navy at the time. As you know, Roosevelt later became the President of the United States. And the other was Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty in England. Churchill later became the Prime Minister of that nation. Apparently, if you do a good job in getting your nation into a war by trickery and deceit, you get to be the leader of your nation. These men were planning an incident to provoke the American people to enter World War I against Germany. And that incident was the sinking of the ocean liner called the Lusitania. This ocean liner was docked in the port of New York on May the 1st, 1915, prior to leaving on a voyage to England. The details that will follow came from a book entitled The Lusitania, written by Colin Simpson and published in 1972. The German government tried to warn the Americans who were buying passage on that ship that they should not do so because the Lusitania was a ship of war going to sail through a war zone, meaning the waters off the coast of England. They issued this advertisement in the New York Times newspaper about 9 days before the sailing. But the administration of President Wilson was encouraging Americans to do exactly that and travel to England. Even though the Lusitania was owned by the Cunard Lines, it was built on a 50-50 basis with the English government, with the provision that it would resort to the government during a time of war as a troop carrier, and that was its status at the time of its sailing from New York. Wilson knew that J.P. Morgan, the influential American banker, had loaded the ship with 6 million rounds of ammunition to assist the English army in their war against Germany. Churchill, as the head of the English Navy, knew the ship was on its way to England and knew that the English government was able to read the messages of the German War Command because they had broken the German War Code. Churchill knew that a German submarine called the U-20 was in the waters around the southern tip of Ireland because he was being notified of their radio messages. He ordered the Lusitania to stop in the water off the southern shore of Ireland and wait for an English cruiser, the Juno, to join it and escort the ship into the port of Liverpool on the western side of the English island, shown up there by the red block by the word Liverpool in the area called Wales. And on page 19 of his book, Colin Simpson details what happened next. It was here the decision was made that was to be the direct cause of the disaster. No one alive knows who made it, but Churchill must share the responsibility. Shortly after noon on May the 5th, the Admiralty signaled the Juno to abandon her escort mission and return to Queenstown. The German submarine saw the ship sitting idly in the water and fired a torpedo at it. The ship sunk and 128 American passengers drowned. The media then played its hand and convinced the American people that this was a cowardly act of the German government and that America should retaliate against them by entering the war. And we did, and America entered World War I against the Germans on April 6, 1917. One of the very many television documentaries about the sunken Lusitania was sent an underwater camera to photograph it, and they discovered that the ship's side was blown out by a massive explosion from inside the hull and not in from the torpedo. This was the confirmation of the claim that the ship's hull contained 6 million rounds of ammunition, and the force of their explosion would blow a hole in the ship under the water line. To show you that the sinking of the Lusitania was a planned event, may I quote Colonel Edward Mandell House, the chief advisor to President Woodrow Wilson. He was asked by Sir Edward Grey, the English Foreign Secretary, who was responsible for relations with foreign countries, "What will America do if Germany sinks an ocean liner with American passengers aboard?" And Colonel House responded, "I believe that a flame of indignation would sweep the United States, and that by itself would be sufficient to carry us into war." Staging an event to get the American people to be willing to become involved in a war happened again in World War II. This was, as I've said, fought between the years of 1941 to 1945. And the American people did not want to become involved in this war either. So the conspirators forced Japan to attack Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December the 7th, 1941. We have been told that the Japanese government maliciously attacked Pearl Harbor without warning nor provocation. But in my book, The Unseen Hand, I discussed the evidence that the American government started forcing Japan to attack us in 1919 after World War I. Churchill, now Prime Minister of England, and Franklin Roosevelt, now President of the United States, needed to stage an incident so that America would join England in its war against Germany. And that incident was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And to understand that event, we need to go back to 1923 when Army General Billy Mitchell was ordered to visit Pearl Harbor to inspect the defenses of the island. This is a book written about the general entitled General Billy Mitchell, published in 1952 by Roger Burlingame. On page 100, he reports the general inspected the island and projected an imaginary war in which Japan would attack, and submitted a report to the commander of the army on the island. And that he understood the vulnerability of unprotected ships at anchor. Nothing was done in shoring up the weaknesses that the general saw. The next step in the plans for the attack occurred in 1932, when the United States conducted a naval exercise on Pearl Harbor. They staged an attack on the harbor from the north, from the sea. And it showed that the island was vulnerable from the north, from the sea. And they invited the Japanese Admiralty to come and watch the attack. Simply stated, the reason they invited the Japanese Admiralty to come to Pearl Harbor was to see that if they ever wanted to attack Pearl Harbor, they should do so from the north by air. And then the American government did nothing to shore up its defenses on the north side of the island. Japanese spies on the island kept Japan informed about the fact that America did nothing to improve the defenses on the northern side. And the final examination at the Japanese Naval Academy after 1932 was to plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. And President Franklin Roosevelt was speaking as the peace candidate. On October the 23rd, 1935, he said, "It shall be my earnest effort to keep this country unentangled from any possible war that may occur across the seas." And later, in October 1940, about 14 months prior to Pearl Harbor, he said, "I shall say it again and again. Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign war." And on December the 7th, 1941, Japan did attack Pearl Harbor. This is a drawing of the anchorage of the harbor on the morning of December the 7th, 1941. The 9 battleships are marked in red, showing that 7 of them were tied up in what could be called a battleship row, meaning that each could be attacked by a series of planes flying from the south right over them in a line. It is an interesting fact that there were 9 battleships in the Pacific Fleet, and all 9 of them were tied up in Pearl Harbor. And there were 3 aircraft carriers, and each of them was out to sea. Many observers find this to be very mysterious. The Navy knew that in a war like the one envisioned in this theater, the battleship would not be of much value, but the aircraft carrier would be. Is this the reason that all of the aircraft carriers were out to sea the morning of the attack, and that the battleships were all tied up in port? These are the results of the Pearl Harbor attack. 4 battleships sunk, 4 of the battleships damaged, 0 aircraft carriers sunk or damaged, and 2,345 military killed. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, he said this: "We don't like it. We didn't want to get in it, but we are in, and we're going to fight it with everything we've got." So he was saying these things all the time. He and his administration were working to provoke Japan into attacking the American forces, because he knew the lesson learned in World War I. Provoke an incident so horrible that the American people will get angry enough to allow the planners to fight a war that they had planned. On December the 8th, President Roosevelt asked Congress for a declaration of war against Japan. He called the attack a day of infamy, but somehow failed to mention that he had assisted in the planning of an incident to get us into a war the people did not want. But once again, this was a staged event intended to provoke the American people to anger, to accept a declaration of war against Japan. And to show you that this was true, I would like to quote Henry Stimson, President Roosevelt's Secretary of War. He made this statement when he was questioned by one of the 9 committees investigating the Pearl Harbor attack. "In spite of the risk involved in letting the Japanese fire the first shot, we realized that in order to have the full support of the American people, it was desirable to make sure the Japanese be the ones to do this, so that there should remain no doubt in anyone's mind as to who were the aggressors. The question was how we should maneuver them into firing the first shot without allowing too much danger to ourselves. As I said, during and after the war, there were 9 congressional investigations into the attack at Pearl Harbor, and not one of them concluded that Roosevelt knew about the impending attack and that he sat in the White House waiting for the news that Pearl Harbor had been attacked that Sunday morning. Several years ago, I found a copy of the top half of the front page of the Hilo, Hawaii Tribune-Herald newspaper with its headline of "Japan May Strike Over Weekend." This newspaper was dated November the 30th, 1941. the Sunday before the next weekend, Saturday the 6th and Sunday the 7th of December. So they were warning Hawaii that a Japanese attack could be coming the next weekend. So the question should be asked, how come this newspaper knew that Japan was going to strike the following weekend, but President Roosevelt did not know? I would hazard a guess that President Roosevelt's intelligence sources were greater than those of the newspaper. But the far more intriguing question is why there were 9 congressional investigations into this question, and none of them determined that Roosevelt knew in advance of the attack. So if the president was not guilty of a dereliction of duty in not preparing for that attack, it must have been Admiral Husband Kimmel, the commanding officer of the Naval Forces, and or General Walter Short, the commander of the armed forces in Hawaii. There were calls for court-martials for these 2 officers. In fact, they demanded a court-martial so that they could prove that they were not derelict in their duties. And none was ever granted. Finally, on May the 25th, 1999, the Senate voted to clear the names of the 2 officers of the charge of a dereliction of duty as a result of the Pearl Harbor bombing. And again, on the 12th of October 2000, the Senate exonerated the 2 military officers of a dereliction of duty in the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But this leads to a far bigger problem. If the 2 officers were not guilty of a dereliction of duty, that means that the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces, President Franklin Roosevelt, was guilty of a dereliction of duty. But Roosevelt was never charged for what he did to provoke Japan into attacking Pearl Harbor. And no one wondered why these 9 congressional investigations did not charge the president with a dereliction, as was done twice by the Senate of the United States. So we have now seen how Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson all created a horrible event to get us into war. They all followed the same script, and to get us willing to go to war, they lied to us. Apparently these 3 men all have read the works of Plato in his book entitled The Republic, who wrote, "The rulers of the state are the only ones who should have the privilege of lying. They may be allowed to lie for the good of the state." And why did these 3 presidents lie to the American people? I believe it was because of George Washington's farewell address as he was leaving public life on September the 17th, 1796. Against the insidious wiles of foreign influence, the jealousy of a free people ought to be constantly awake. Since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most ruinous foes of Republican government. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is, it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliance with any portion of the foreign world. And that was America's foreign policy from 1786 to 1916. For about 130 years, we stayed out of the affairs of foreign nations until World War I. So in summary, the conspirators wanted a war in Vietnam, and the American people didn't. So they staged a phony event. The Gulf of Tonkin incident never happened. They tricked us. So we would now get tied down in a land war in Asia. But the planners had another problem. Vietnam was largely an agrarian economy. About 80% of the people lived on farms. They had no war-making technology. They had no missiles, no radar, no tanks, no jet aircraft, and no rifles. But these planners wanted a 20th century war. And there were only two major countries that had missiles, radar, tanks, jet aircraft, and rifles. They were the nations of the United States and the Soviet Union. So the plan became one that would have the Soviet Union supply the North and the United States supply the South. And then the United States would supply Communist Russia. In other words, the United States supplied both sides of the war. This is a cartoon that appeared in the Dallas Morning newspaper sometime during the Vietnamese War. The entire cartoon shows this trade rather dramatically. The upper right-hand corner shows a smiling Uncle Sam carrying trade to the Russian officer, who in turn pipelines it down to the North Vietnamese. And out of the pipeline comes rations, medicine, rifles, pistols, hand grenades, and machine guns. And since this is a two-party trade, Uncle Sam has to get something back in return, and they did, dead American soldiers in flag-draped coffins. This was, in cartoon form, one of the untold stories of the Vietnamese War, but it was 100% accurate. This sale of technology to Communist Russia not only went on during the entirety of the war in Vietnam, it has been going on ever since the Communist Revolution of 1917 in Russia. And it has been our policy under both Democrat and Republican administrations. This is Anthony Sutton, who has written at least 6 books on the subject of this aid and trade being sent to Russia, including this book entitled National Suicide, America's Military Aid to the Soviet Union, published in 1973. These are Professor Sutton's conclusions. There is no such thing as Soviet technology. Let me repeat that. There is no such thing as Soviet technology. Almost all, perhaps 90 to 95%, came from the United States and its NATO allies. What this means is that the United States has constructed its own enemy, Russian communism. Sutton went on, the Soviet Union has used American technology to kill Americans. And this sale of war-making technology went on during the entire Vietnamese War. Next, I would like to discuss the evidence that our government knew that this statement of Professor Sutton's was true. The U.S. News and World Report magazine during the 1968 campaign, meaning right in the middle of the war in Vietnam, reproduced the 1968 Republican Party platform. The red lines on the left side are the ones that I'm going to read. This is what the party said. Nations hostile to this country will receive no assistance from the United States. What that means that if your nation is fighting the United States, your nation will not receive assistance in any form from the United States. What is wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. That is a perfectly moral, constitutional, and rational position. We would want the Republican Party, and for that matter, the Democrat Party as well, to take such a position. The Republican Party continued, "We will not provide aid of any kind to countries which aid and abet the war efforts of North Vietnam." The Republican Party knew that Communist Russia was the major supplier of aid to North Vietnam, so this promise was primarily directed to that nation, but is obviously applied to any country assisting the North Vietnamese in killing Americans. Once again, what's wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. That is the perfectly moral, constitutional, and rational position. Candidate Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for president in 1968, ran on that platform. He was also victorious in his quest as he was elected president of the United States. This U.S. News and World Report article, issued after the election, listed what we could expect from a Nixon presidency. We'll read the quote around 7 o'clock on the left. Candidate Nixon said this at the American Legion Convention that September before the election. "There should be no aid or credit of any kind with any country, including the Soviet Union, that aids the enemy in Vietnam. How could anything be clearer than this? The American government should not assist anyone in the killing of America's fighting men." What is wrong with that? Absolutely nothing. That is a perfectly moral, constitutional, and rational position. As I said, it was known by the American government that about 80% of the war-making technology came to North Vietnamese from the Soviet Union. So candidate Nixon was specifically addressing the Soviet Union. And as I said, Nixon won the presidency in 1968. One can only wonder whether candidate Nixon knew what the premier of North Vietnam said on May the 24th, 1965. "We shall defeat the Americans with Soviet weapons." Now could the question become, did President Nixon deliver on the promises he made as candidate Nixon? And the answer is a resounding no. The Export Control Act of 1949 provides the President with the authority to prohibit exports from the United States for any or all of three reasons: foreign policy, short supply, and or national security. We were at war with North Vietnam, although it was not declared by Congress in accordance with the Constitution. So President Nixon could prohibit exports to Communist Russia and claim it was in the interest of national security because he had the power to do so. Notice that the President alone has this power. He does not need to go to Congress. He does not need to go to the people. He has the power by himself. All presidents have had the power since 1949. So therefore, President Nixon could deliver on the promises made by candidate Nixon and the Republican Party platform. He promised us that he would not provide any aid to the Soviet Union during the war. We can now determine if he delivered on that promise. The Department of Commerce prints a quarterly report called Export Control. This covers from the third quarter of 1969. Notice that since this is a quarterly report, it only covers 3 months of a year. By the way, I've read all of these reports at the University of Arizona several years ago. I would like to use the report for the third quarter of 1971, a year and a half before the war ended, for a specific reason that I will explain in a few minutes. Nixon was still president in 1971, and Americans were still dying in Vietnam. Page 11 of this report lists the commodities licensed for export to East European destinations in the third quarter of 1971. This is a copy of that page, and it lists the products sent to the Russian government on the bottom third of the list on the left and all of the right side. I would like to discuss 8 of these goods sent to Russia in just this one quarter alone, when President Nixon knew that the Russians were supplying at least 80% of the war-making technology to North Vietnam. We sent Russia polyvinyl butyrol, a synthetic rubber used in bulletproof glass. Apparently the North Vietnamese drivers of the Russian tanks were getting shot, so they needed a bulletproof glass to equip their tanks. Ethyl anti-knock compounds. This product is used in gasoline to reduce engine knocks. $170 million worth of electronic computers, parts, and accessories. Parts for rolling mills. As I understand it, rolling mills make steel. Ball and roller bearings. This is one of the most strategic items we sold them. You cannot roll a tank, move an armored personnel carrier, rotate a radar system, or fire a missile without ball and roller bearings. Russia supplied tanks, armored personnel carriers, radar, and missiles to North Vietnam, and we sent ball and roller bearings to Russia. We also sent Russia $4 million worth of oil and gas field production equipment. We sent Russia the latest technology on improving their gas production facilities. Apparently the Russian gasoline octane wasn't high enough. We sent them airborne navigation equipment and parts. Apparently the Russian planes were crashing into the mountains in Vietnam. So we sent them the latest technology on better navigation equipment. And lastly, this is the reason I selected this report to use. We sent Communist Russia $17 million worth of trucks and parts in that one quarter alone. This is a map of Vietnam, and you will see red arrows showing you where a road was utilized for moving goods from North Vietnam into South Vietnam to kill Americans in South Vietnam, called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Communist Russia was supplying trucks to North Vietnam so that they could move these supplies. And American pilots were asked to destroy these trucks to reduce the flow of war-making technology and soldiers into the South. Russia must have been losing a great number of their trucks, so they called their wholesaler, the United States, and ordered some more. And their wholesaler sold them a new supply. U.S. News and World Report had an article in their January 30th, 1967 issue that stated that the North Vietnamese war machine runs almost entirely on Russian oil. In the past 18 months, the Russians shipped in 300,000 tons. In December of 1966, the Soviets shipped nearly 25,000 metric tons of gasoline and oil into Haiphong. And the United States sent Russia oil and gas field production equipment. I have heard from pilots in Vietnam that there was a Standard Oil refinery in Haiphong operating all the time during the entirety of the war. Maybe this technology was being sent into the Standard Oil refinery located there. I do know this: the port of Haiphong was off limits to American bombers during the entirety of the war. I guess the planners were afraid some aircraft would blow up the refinery there and all of the Russian motorized equipment would run out of gasoline. So they made the port off limits to bombing runs. That makes sense, doesn't it? Before I leave this export control bulletin, I would like to relate a very intriguing discovery that I made a few years ago. I first heard about these reports back in the 1970s during the war. I purchased 3 of them directly from the Department of Commerce or the U.S. Government Printing Office and kept them for my files. I wrote about their contents in my 1985 book entitled The Unseen Hand. I showed them in my lectures and videos by taking pictures of them for that slide presentation that I made entitled Vietnam, America's Betrayal and Treason. In other words, I was making them a source of excellent documentation of this aid and trade between the United States and Communist Russia. And I visited the University of Arizona Library to check something after I had read through each one of them at some earlier date. They were not on the shelf where I had found them just a few months before. So I asked the librarian if they had been removed to another location and was told that they had been asked to destroy them for space reasons. Apparently they felt they simply took up too much room. Now, the report was first printed in the third quarter of 1947, as best I can determine, and quarterly thereafter, which means that they would have printed a total of 214 of them by the last quarter of the year 2000, if that was the year that they told me that they had to destroy them because of a lack of space. Now, simple math tells me that 214 reports at about a quarter of an inch in width means that all of the reports could be stored on less than a 5-foot-long shelf. I called the library at the at Arizona State University and at the state capitol, and they also reported that they had been asked to destroy the reports because of a lack of space. Now, the University of Arizona is a 4-story library with an attached 3-story wing and a complete basement. And I would suppose they house thousands of books on hundreds of shelves. So a 5-foot shelf would not take up too much space. But I think someone in the United States government was asked to have these destroyed all over the United States because I was making it public as a way to confirm that it has been the United States government that was supplying the Russians with the material to kill Americans in the Vietnamese War. And the government did not want you to know that. This is a shorter form issued by the Department of Commerce. This report was issued on October the 12th, 1966. It reports that the department was revising the commodity control list to permit 400 non-strategic commodities to move under general license to the USSR. Please remember that these goods were termed non-strategic by our Department of Commerce. But I am of the opinion that non-strategic goods can be used as strategic goods if they have applications for war-making technology. I am certain that our government was given some reassurance by the Communist Russian government that they would never use a non-strategic good for strategic purposes. Certainly, we got that confirmation, didn't we? Maybe we took them at their word so that they were not going to send them to Vietnam to kill Americans. Our government would not send Russia something that could be used to kill Americans. Certainly not. In that list were the following: bandages and surgical dressings, rifle cleaning compounds. Please remember this for a reason I will discuss in a few minutes. Shipping containers, aircraft and automotive spark plugs, and petroleum. I am certain that none of these goods were then sent to North Vietnam to assist the North Vietnamese kill American soldiers. In 1967, November, a special House Armed Services Subcommittee released a report that claimed that American soldiers in Vietnam were experiencing a frequent shortage of rifle cleaning equipment. That must mean that the Russians got first priority over our own fighting men in Vietnam. We didn't want to upset our communist Russian allies in this war, did we? Between 1967 and 1969, the Russians imported $30 million worth of cattle hides from the United States. I don't know how the Russians used these hides, but I do know that combat boots are made from cattle hides. But I am certain that we got, once again, some guarantee from the Russians that none of these hides would be used in making boots for the North Vietnamese soldiers busy stomping through the jungles in combat boots as they killed Americans. I'm certain we got that guarantee. In 1969, the Export Control Bulletin reported that America sold Russia 7 million pounds of tungsten. Tungsten is used in making armor plate steel for tanks and armored personnel carriers. I can imagine that the Department of Commerce also got some guarantee from the Russians that this tungsten was going to be used in making taxi cabs stronger in Russia. And to show you that there was real concern for this type of foreign aid, my research developed that in late 1969, America loaned Sweden $50 million. In 1970, Sweden loaned $45 million to North Vietnam. Apparently, Sweden kept $5 million as a carrying charge for the cost of handling the transaction, because America would never loan money directly to communist North Vietnam. We would want to use a middleman, in this case the nation of Sweden, to handle the transaction for us, and we'd pay them $5 million. Keep saying Sweden is our ally. But I must be honest in my reporting. President Johnson did take one significant step towards curtailing the exportation of strategic goods during the war under the provisions of the Export Control Act of 1949. In 1966, he decided to prohibit American businessmen from sending petroleum, rubber chemicals, and iron and steel products to one of our most feared enemies during the Cold War, the nation known as Rhodesia. Perhaps he misunderstood and thought he was prohibiting these products to be sent to Russia and not Rhodesia. Understand that both nations spell the name of their country with an R at the beginning. And that certainly could be an honest mistake, couldn't it? Anyway, he made no such effort in the case of Russia during the war. Johnson explained his decision with these words: "The general policy is to deny applications for such items that would make a significant contribution to the economy." Apparently, the sale of these products to Russia, when they were supplying them to the North Vietnamese to kill Americans, wasn't deemed to make a significant contribution to the economy of Russia. Rhodesia was deemed to be a higher risk than communist Russia. So we curtailed the shipment of these goods to them and not the Russian government. By the way, Rhodesia wanted to send troops to Vietnam to fight alongside the American boys, and Johnson refused. Now, it wasn't as if Congress and the President did not know that Russia was supplying goods to North Vietnam to kill Americans during the war. I would like to give you at least two evidences of that fact that the American government did know. Congressman H.R. Gross of Iowa introduced an amendment to the Foreign Aid Bill in November of 1967 to prohibit American foreign aid grants to nations which traded with North Vietnam. The bill was defeated by Congress. What's wrong with the bill? Absolutely nothing. That is a perfectly moral, constitutional, and rational position. But the Congress didn't agree, and they defeated the amendment. In 1969, Congressman Earl Landgraf, shown on the left here, proposed an amendment to the Export Control Act of 1949, which read, "No commodities, military or otherwise, shall be authorized for shipment to any foreign nation which sells or furnishes to North Vietnam any equipment, materials, or commodities." In other words, if you help our enemy, we will not help you. What's wrong with that? Nothing. It's a perfectly moral, constitutional, and rational position. But the amendment was defeated in Congress. I would now like to give you an example of a congressman who supported the sale of this technology to Communist Russia to kill Americans during the Vietnamese War. This is Arizona's Congressman Morris Udall, one of several. And on July 14, 1977, I wrote this letter to him. I told him about the sale of technology to Russia while they were supplying 80% of the technology to kill Americans in Vietnam. I asked him, why did you not oppose this continuing sale while you were publicly opposed to our involvement in the war in Vietnam and you had a chance as a congressman to vote against it? I wrote, I'm certain that you will agree with me that such trade with Communist Russia was immoral and that it should not be allowed to continue. He responded by sending me this letter on July the 20th, 1977. He wrote, the more the Soviet Union opens up to Western technology, the more their society opens up, and thus the more susceptible to change they become. While I would prefer that they might not have our military technology, I'm sure you would agree with me that sharing our other technology is and will continue to be beneficial to all concerned. And then he signed it, sincerely, Morris Udall. Notice that he said that Russia would open up and become more susceptible to change. Did they change during the entirety of the Vietnamese War? No, they stayed committed to killing Americans by sending North Vietnam the technology it needed to kill Americans. Here is the fallacy in his thinking. Let's say that we sold Russia wheat as a non-strategic trade. That would free up Russian farmers from producing wheat so that they could work in a factory producing strategic products that could be used to kill Americans in Vietnam. Here is the truth. There was no non-strategic aid with the Soviet Union during the war in Vietnam. Everything they bought was used to kill Americans. In 1977, prior to me writing that letter, I met the congressman after a speech at a luncheon open to the public. I had this quarterly report in my hand and I handed it to him. I asked him first if he was in Congress during this quarter, and he said he was. I asked him then why he supported the sale of this technology to Russia while it was known that they were supplying some 80% of the technology to North Vietnam to kill Americans. And listen to his answer. He said, it creates jobs. So I responded, yes it does. The morticians who bury the Americans who were killed because of the sale of this technology were able to hire more technicians to bury these soldiers. And the congressman walked away. Now ask yourself if this was a good policy. Ask the people who lost sons or fathers or husbands during the war. Let them decide if this was a good policy, but for some strange reason they were never asked. Because they knew that these survivors would not have approved of it, because they knew it was a policy of our government that murdered their family members. It was not a good policy. I would now like to give you another example of how American technology was being used to kill Americans. This is Sergeant Peter Stark, a former Green Beret sergeant in Vietnam. He came to Portland, Oregon in 1970 as a part of a nationwide speaking tour in which he discussed his involvement in the war. This is what he said in part. In 1966, after the war started in 1964, the United States sent the Soviet Union the specifications to a glycerol plant. Glycerol is used in the manufacture of explosives. Specifically in Vietnam, glycerol is used as a detonator in booby traps. Now this is a poor quality drawing I made myself of what a booby trap looks like. It was used in Vietnam and was made in communist Russia. It consists of two parts. The glycerol is in the top container and the TNT is in the bottom. In Vietnam, they would dig a hole, bury the landmine, and then cover it with a thin layer of dirt. A soldier would come walking through the area and would not see the booby trap and step on it. This would cause the glycerol on the top to explode down, causing the TNT to explode, and then the entire thing, including the shattered metal casing, would come back up, either blowing off the arms or the legs of the person who stepped on it or killing him outright. Sergeant Stark then told us just how important these landmines were in Vietnam. He said over 50% of all American casualties suffered in Vietnam have come from booby traps. This is again a close-up of Sergeant Peter Stark, retired of the U.S. Army. The picture does not show it, but he is seated in a wheelchair because he stepped on a booby trap. He gave his speech on crutches, as I remember. Who blew off his legs? Was it the North Vietnamese? Was it the Viet Cong? Was it the Russians? No, it was the United States government for exporting the specifications of a glycerol plant during the Vietnamese War. I would like to tell you a personal story. In 1968, I was married. My wife was a member of the Junior League, a group of young women who did acts of charity. During the Christmas season, they arranged for their organization to visit a veterans hospital near Oakland, California, and take candy and cookies to those patients who could not go home for the holidays, as a way of thanking them for what they had done for those of us in America by their sacrifice. We went from ward to ward singing Christmas carols, and we came to a ward where the patients all had missing arms or legs. I started down the row of beds with my sack of candy and stopped to chat with several of these young soldiers. When suddenly I remembered the sale of the technology to Russia to make a glycerol plant so that the Russians could make booby traps to injure these fine young men in this hospital. I excused myself and went outside the hospital and cried. I cried because I knew who had blown off their arms or legs. It was the very government that sent them to the war. And I cried because I hadn't done enough to stop this madness. I would now like to start my explanation as to why all of this happened. Just what was the purpose of the Vietnamese War? Why did the conspiracy plan the war in at least 1945? This is a picture of Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, during World War II, giving his famous V for victory sign. He used it to rally the English people during the war so that they would support his efforts to win a victory in World War II. This is the same sign being given during the war in Vietnam, but it was being flashed by the radical left, not to bring a victory to the troops fighting in the war, but to signify peace. Those who flashed this sign generally wanted our government to totally withdraw their troops and bring a climate of peace to the area. And it was flashed all the time during the war, not to bring a condition of peace to the war, but to indicate that victory in Vietnam was not an option. No one that I could find explained just what the letter V had to do with peace. Some claimed that it was because the anti-war protesters could not spell. But the media stole the victory symbol from those who wanted a victory in Vietnam and then a withdrawal of our troops, allowing the people in South Vietnam a full measure of freedom, not a future filled with the slavery of communism. Here is a picture of a young woman flashing the sign in 1986, apparently because the media was giving the sign back to those who wanted a victory in any war. So we must ask why the media took the sign away from those who wanted a victory in the war in Vietnam. And it was simply because the planners and the media that they controlled did not want a victory in Vietnam, for very important reasons not made public to the American people until I released that singular reason in the first edition of this lecture back in 1992. But there were people talking about victory in Vietnam. This is a flyer announcing a movie to be shown in Portland, Oregon when I lived there in 1971. The picture in the lower left is that of John Wayne, the movie star, the moderator of the movie that featured political leaders, military officers, and even a couple of people from the media representing the case for a victory in Vietnam. And some in America decided that one way to achieve a victory in Vietnam was to do just that. Cut off the supplies from the enemy, and the war would wither and end of its own weight. And they reasoned that the way to accomplish this was to have an American government bring an end to the sale of war-making technology to the communist Russian government. And they started a nationwide petition drive to get Congress to do exactly that between the years of 1967 and 1971. This particular petition was issued during Phase 2 of the drive, started in 1970. The committee that started the drive was called SHAME, S-H-A-M-E, which stood for Stop Helping America's Marxist Enemies. These people collected more than 4 million signatures, reportedly the largest petition drive in the history of the United States. The signatures were collected in groups of 10,000 and then delivered to the President and the Congress of the United States. This is a list of the congressmen and senators who were given signed copies of the petitions between May the 14th, 1968 and June the 29th, 1970, when the total of signatures totaled about 1.7 million at that time. So who was it that conducted the petition drive? Was it the VFW, the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, the Daughters of the American Revolution? Was it CBS News after doing a television program exposing the subject? Was it the AFL or the CIO unions? It was none of the above. There was only one group in the entirety of the United States that cared enough about the issue. It was the John Birch Society. They were the only ones in America who attempted to stop the sale of this war-making technology that was being used to kill Americans. But the tragic truth is that Congress did not want to stop it. Only the John Birch Society and the 4 million people who signed the petitions. Yet the Birch Society was being attacked by the American media as being an extreme group of radicals. And Congress and the President did not stop this trade even after they received the signed petitions. And the reason no one in the American government was listening was because it was the official policy of the government to promote this trade. This is Department of State publication 8117, issued in August of 1966, about a year after the war started. As you can see, it is called Private Boycotts boycotts versus the national interest. And this is what it said on page 2. Is it illegal or unpatriotic to sell peaceful goods to the communist countries of Eastern Europe? A small but active minority apparently believes it is unpatriotic to trade in any products from any communist country. Are these Americans advancing the interests of the United States? The government of the United States does not believe so. On the contrary, it believes they are harming the United States' national interest by obstructing a foreign policy that has been developed by 4 administrations since World War II. And I say this in response. I say those who supported this sale of technology were murderers. Next, I would like to explain how the American government intentionally frustrated the efforts of the soldiers and airmen in the war. In his book, Navy pilot Jim Stockdale wrote, all targets in Vietnam were selected in Washington on the basis of a naive idea that delicate peacemaking signals could be transmitted by military action. My pilots saw it as taking very expensive and highly capable airplanes right by the power plant to bomb the privy, meaning an outhouse. We found ourselves foolishly risking airplanes and pilots' lives on meaningless targets. What the Admiral said was confirmed in another source, in this case in an article on the Vietnamese War. This comment was made by an unnamed Air Force pilot who was quoted in 1967 as saying that he was ordered to destroy an empty bus and a buffalo pulling an irrigation wheel and an empty straw-thatched hut. John McCain, the senator from my state of Arizona, and of course the 2008 Republican Party candidate for President of the United States, was a Vietnam pilot and who was shot down to become a prisoner of war for several years, also confirmed the reports just cited. He said that the first target he was asked to destroy in his multi-million-dollar A-4 Skyhawk bomber was a military barracks already blown up by countless bombing raids. So the question is, who ordered these pilots to risk their aircraft and their very lives attacking meaningless targets? Was it the generals in the Air Force and Navy? No, it was the civilian policymakers who were responsible for the conduct of the war. And they were working in agreement with the President, the Commander-in-Chief of all of the American military forces. These policy planners had issued what they called the Rules of Engagement. They were published in 1985 in the Congressional Record, and I would like to discuss some of the more significant ones. This is an actual photograph taken in Vietnam of the 2 Russian-made MiG fighters parked on a dirt runway, big fighters. Should an American pilot spot these 2 planes, they could not destroy them before they took off to engage the American pilot. They could only engage the planes after they had taken off and displayed some form of hostile intent. This is a photograph taken of a North Vietnamese surface-to-air missile site showing 4 SAM missiles, surface-to-air. The American pilots could not destroy these missiles supplied by our communist ally, the Soviet Union, while the missile sites were being constructed only after they were operational. The result of these strange rules of engagement was that 80% of the American prisoners of war captured by the North Vietnamese were airmen shot down over missile sites and air bases. America's prisoners of war were not the ground soldiers who were actually in hand-to-hand combat with the North Vietnamese. They were pilots shot down by these strange rules of engagement. Air Force General John Lavelle tried to protect his American pilots after the rules of engagement cost him the lives of 2 of his pilots. He ordered airstrikes on his own authority on North Vietnamese airfields and missile sites. This was, of course, in violation of the rules of engagement. Was he hailed as an American hero? No, he was relieved of his command for violating the rules of engagement. The admirals and generals tried to solve the actual the admirals and generals who were asked to do the actual combat against the North Vietnamese in this war tried to solve the problem. They prepared lists consisting of the strategic targets that had to be destroyed to win the war. They then had to submit these lists to the civilian planners in Washington, D.C. for their approval. Did the planners grant them the approval necessary to destroy these strategic targets? No, they did not. On the list prepared for the year 1966, only 22 out of the 242 on the generals and admirals list had been struck by the end of the war. That is less than 10%. In that year alone, American pilots flew a total of 106,000 combat sorties against North Vietnam. Less than 1% of these sorties were flown against the vital targets on the list of the admirals and generals. The American ground forces were also affected by these rules of engagement. The planners who decided how the war was going to be fought decided that they would not win the entire country, just part of it. So I made this little illustration to try to illustrate that. They decided to herd the South Vietnamese people into what they called strategic hamlets, and then build an army base around them. The base was there to protect the civilians living inside the hamlet, but the surrounding area was not protected by putting troops in that area. They were only there to protect the perimeter. I'm going to make up an illustration using a fictitious American sergeant, Brent Culpepper of Atlanta, Georgia, to make my point about this concept of these strategic hamlets. The sergeant is assigned the duty of leading a squad of 10 of these soldiers, including himself, to provide protection for the Vietnamese. 9 soldiers plus the sergeant. One night, some Viet Cong soldiers, shown by the initials VC, crawl up on top of the hill outside of the perimeter and lob mortar shells into the base. The lieutenant orders Sergeant Culpepper to take his squad up the hill, and the 10 of them eliminate the North Vietnamese mortar squad. Let's say that he does and returns to the lieutenant to give his report. He says that he lost 2 of his men and that there are now 8 of them, but that the mortar squad was eliminated. The lieutenant thanks him for a job well done and expresses regret about the loss of the 2 soldiers. The next night, more Viet Cong crawl up on the mountain to lob more mortar shells into the base. Sergeant Culpepper and his 7-man squad is ordered to return to the hill and clean out the Viet Cong, and he does as he was ordered. He returns to the base and gives his report to the lieutenant. Let's say that he reports the loss of 2 more men and that there are only 6 of them now, but that he accomplished the task assigned to him. The next night, more Viet Cong crawl up on the mountain to lob more mortar shells into the hamlet. The sergeant is once again ordered up the mountain to clean out this new group of the Viet Cong, and the sergeant does as he was ordered. He returns to the base, now with a total of only 4 men, and makes his report. After the sergeant gives his report to the lieutenant, he starts thinking about how stupid this strategic hamlet strategy is. He wonders why the Army does not station men on top of the mountain to keep that land free of Viet Cong firing mortar rounds and then protect the entire countryside. but that was not the strategy of the war. It was to protect the hamlet from a direct assault. He then concludes that this whole war, does not make sense, and that they should include the mountains outside the perimeter to protect the entire hamlet. Notice that the strategy of the war was never to defeat the North Vietnamese, take the territory, and free it from communist control. It was just to protect what you had created, the strategic hamlets. And the sergeant begins to question the whole thing. He gets frustrated as he grieves over the loss of 6 of his men and then decides to take a decisive action himself. He decides to strike out at the Army's authority itself. He decides to commit an act called fragging. Fragging stands for fragmenting, meaning you take a hand grenade, pull the pin, and then throw it at your officer as a way of protesting the stupidity of the war. Fragging was the intentional murder of your officer by fragging him with a grenade because the war did not make any sense. This act was the result of the soldiers' overall frustration at the entire war and how it was being fought. Wikipedia on the internet says that they have documented 230 such cases, but as many as 1,400 other officers' deaths could not be explained. I've had Vietnamese veterans in my audiences nod their heads in agreement when I discuss these fragging incidents, indicating that many of them knew they were going on. And I would now like to show you one cartoonist who apparently knows that these fragging incidents did happen. I would like to show you 4 panels from a daily cartoon that appears in our local morning newspaper that were shown in December of 1990. The cartoon is named Doonesbury and is drawn by Gary Trudeau. The first panel shows an enlisted man sitting in a tent, and off of the panel we hear an officer greet him. "Good evening, Sergeant." And the sergeant responds, "Evening, sir." The second panel shows the officer asking the sergeant, "What's going on over there?" And the sergeant responds, "It's just BD, sir. He's telling old Vietnam War stories." BD, I believe, is Doonesbury, the hero of the cartoon. And in the third panel, the officer says, "Good. That should inspire the men." And in the last panel, the soldier on the left, looking rather incredulous, says, "You're kidding. You shot your own officers?" And BD says, "Just the dumb ones, lieutenants mostly." Of course, Doonesbury did not say that they threw grenades at their officers, but he makes the point that enlisted men were killing their officers. Harry Moore, on page 616 of his book entitled Strange Ground, defines fragging as a fragmentation hand grenade as a verb, the action of trying to kill a superior officer. And then he says this about fragging on page 161 of his book: fragging became an occupational hazard for officers. Obviously, many people knew this was going on. And it just wasn't the strategic hamlet policy that caused this. It was the entire planning of this war. It simply did not make sense. So the question became, was it planned not to make sense? And the unqualified answer is yes, for a reason that I shall discuss a little later in this presentation. Senator Barry Goldwater was critical of the way the war was planned and was moved to comment. The unskilled amateurs should leave waging a war to professionals, because their interference could result in a greater sacrifice in blood. U.S. military forces did not lose the war in Vietnam. Civilian policy makers did. General William Westmoreland, the American commanding officer in South Vietnam, wrote this: We are fighting a limited war with limited objectives and with limited means. And Ralph Epperson says this: only death was not limited. Air Force General Curtis LeMay, the Chief of the Staff of the United States Air Force, explained why we did not want to win this war. In Vietnam, we violated every principle of war because Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, was afraid Russia would get mad. And of course, we did not want to anger our communist ally, Russia, the Soviet Union. The American government apparently felt that Russia was neutral in this war, and if we got them angry, they might become directly involved and start sending war-making technology into the war zone to kill Americans. I wish I had had the way of contacting these planners during the war to advise them that Russia was already mad at us and was sending billions of dollars worth of war-making technology into the war zone to kill Americans. But since I didn't, that must have been the reason that not one of these planners knew that Russia was involved in sending war-making technology to North Vietnam. And I shall always regret that I was unable to find a way of letting them know. But just between you and me, I somehow think they knew. It is my opinion that it was Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State during President Nixon's administration, who was the major planner for this war. Someone else agreed. Syndicated columnist Joseph C. Harsh wrote, Kissinger was one of the top experts to conclude that military victory in Vietnam is neither possible nor desirable. If this is true, Kissinger should have gone public with his concerns and done all he could to have ended the war. But to my recollection, he did not do such a thing. Why did he feel America could not win the war? In 1976, when he was Secretary of State, nationally syndicated columnist Ernest Cuneo wrote, Kissinger's new position assumed that the American people do not have the courage nor the strength to stand up to communism if it means war. So it must have been his plan to just play at the war, and maybe the North Vietnamese would just go away. And that thought was passed on to President Johnson, according to Air Force Chief of Staff General John McConnell. President Johnson has emphasized that it is our national policy to keep this conflict at the lowest possible level of intensity for humanitarian as well as political reasons. So we are going to murder our armed services for humanitarian purposes. I say this: if you do not commit this nation to victory, do not commit this nation to war. End of section 2. Please go to disc number 2 for sections 3 and 4. Vietnam, America's Betrayal and Treason. Disc number 2, section 3 of 4. Now, as I explain the next part of the story, please keep saying Russia is neutral, Russia is neutral. Remember that these planners felt that if we escalated the war, Russia might get directly involved and we would be facing the threat of a nuclear war. So it appears as if that is why these planners did not seek a victory in this war. We have already seen how the Russians sent supplies to North Vietnam to kill Americans. Now let's see if they had any other involvement in the war. During that time, I personally felt that they were doing more than supplying the North Vietnamese. I believe that they actually had troops there. But I had no proof until April the 14th, 1989, when this article appeared in my local newspaper. The headline reads, "As you can see, Soviet Army also fought in Vietnam." And the article said, Soviet soldiers sent to the Vietnam War as anti-aircraft technicians took part in missile launching combat and shot down U.S. aircraft. The article quoted a Soviet colonel as saying that his regiment had fired 43 missiles and downed 23 airplanes. Remember, keep saying that if we got Russia mad, they would start firing missiles at us. I would like to now give you some confirmation that our government knew that the Russians were actually providing soldiers to assist in the fighting in Vietnam. This is Colonel Laird Gutterson, who was an Air Force pilot in Vietnam and who was shot down by a missile and was a prisoner of war for many years before he was released at the end of the war. He came to one of my speeches on Vietnam and came up to talk to me after the lecture. He said he knew that the Russians were on the ground firing missiles at him and other Air Force pilots. I asked him how he knew, and he replied that they were told which missile sites had Russian soldiers at them during their briefings by Air Force intelligence before they flew their missions. He told me that they were told not to fire at those missile sites, even if they fired missiles at them. I asked him what he did with that information, and he said that he just flew by obeying the instructions of the Air Force officers briefing them. You see, we did not want to get the Russians mad at us, because if we did, they might send soldiers into Vietnam with missiles they could fire at us. And I responded that he had more courage than I had. If I was an Air Force pilot under these circumstances, I would have walked into my commanding officer's office and told him that I was quitting. I was going home. I was not going to fight in a war where someone was stacking all of the odds against me. I admitted that I would probably have been court-martialed for disobeying an order, but then I would come back to America and tell the American people the truth about how the war was being waged. But Colonel Gunderson and probably hundreds of other pilots or colonels did not do this. And the war went on. And if all of the pilots had stopped and gone home, the war would have ended. Because without Air Force pilots, there would be no air war in Vietnam. And without soldiers who also stopped and went home, there would have been no ground war in Vietnam. Remember the bumper sticker, suppose they gave a war and no one showed up. But no one stopped and went home, and 58,000 Americans died. Now, I would like to address the belief of these government planners, including Henry Kissinger, that if we got Russia angry at us during the war, we could be facing a nuclear war with them firing nuclear missiles at the United States. And I want to comment by bringing it to your attention that I have discovered the documented evidence that the claim that Russia has thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles is a gigantic lie. I would like to show you a 4-hour DVD that I produced entitled Only the U.S. Has Nukes, in which I provide the evidence so that you can know that these planners knew that this was true, even as they were saying that we should not escalate this war because of the nuclear war threat. Now, I understand that the world believes that Russia does have thousands of nuclear-tipped missiles, and that I am probably the only one in the world, that I know of at least, claiming that this is a huge lie, and that our government knows this. And I have provided you with the evidence that I've accumulated in over 40 years of research into this subject. May I suggest that you open up and give me 4 hours of your time to watch this DVD, and I am convinced that the evidence will convince you that I am right. Now, if that is true, and I can provide evidence that our own government knows this, then we need to examine the reasons they were advancing this theory. And my best explanation is that this was their way of convincing the skeptics that they should support this limited warfare because of the threat of a nuclear war from Russia if we escalated it. And this would be their method of getting the support of hundreds of bureaucrats and the media in their no-victory scenario. And that would explain why they continued this war for 10 years, when they had the way to win it. It is the only thing that makes sense, because it is the only way they could drag this war out for a decade to get the soldiers and others so frustrated they would revert to other means to escape it. So may I repeat myself and encourage you to visit my website shown at the end of this DVD and locate the DVD entitled Only the U.S. Has Nukes, and then be open. It will make enormous sense to you and will finally explain how they tricked us into continuing a no-win war for 10 years. Now I'd like to return to the narrative. I would like to remind you that I asked you to become members of a jury at the beginning of this presentation, and I would like you to be as impartial as you can be, because there are some things we need to discuss that are not pleasant, but that we need to examine. Because it is quite likely that even when you hear it, you will probably hold that I cannot be right. This simply could not have happened. In other words, it is quite likely that you will not believe it. So it will be my challenge to document the case as well as I can, and hope that you will accept what your eyes will tell you. Because what I've discovered will make enormous sense about why we planned the war and then fought it for about 10 years. I've discovered the evidence that President John Kennedy was assassinated because he wanted to end a war before it started. He was murdered by a conspiracy so evil that it boggles the mind to even think about it. He was murdered for a reason that, as far as I can tell, no one else in this nation is saying. We have been lied to, and it is time to finally tell the truth. So with that understanding, it is now time to tell the truth about Vietnam, America's betrayal and treason. It is my contention that the civilian planners inside the American government actually planned on frustrating the American fighting man for a reason that has not been made known to the American people. I am going to act as a prosecutor by presenting the evidence that a major crime was committed by some powerful and influential people in and around the American government. But you say the defense is not here present to defend itself. But the truth is that the defense has been defending itself all during the conduct of the war and ever since it ended in 1975. You have heard their defense for about 35 years. Lastly, I'm going to charge these planners with the crime of first-degree premeditated murder. Let me start by discussing how the academic world and the media worked together with the government to make certain that the war was not won. Let me illustrate that with the use of a specific example that happened to me. In 1970, I was working in downtown Portland, Oregon. One day during lunchtime, I saw an anti-war protest demonstration come down the street in amongst the skyscrapers of downtown Portland. I thought I would stay and watch, so I went to the curb and stood as it passed by. The first thing I saw was a man on the roof of a large van with a battery-powered hand microphone. He was leading the marchers in a chant that went like this: 1, 2, 3, 4. We don't want your F ... war. Now, I've chosen not to say that word because the word that they were using in that chant, because I do not use it in my vocabulary. And then I thought that was a very curious thing to say if they wanted me and the other observers to support their cause. You would think they would use words that would appeal to the people standing and watching. Then as the marchers came by, I noticed that one of them was carrying the American flag. I was taught as a boy to stand when I saw the American flag in a parade. I love that flag and the republic for which it stands. It is to me a symbol of the freedoms that we as free people have in America, including the right to protest a governmental action such as this war. And then, right in front of me and many others, they burned the flag. This was really a strange thing to do if they wanted me and the others to support their goal. Yet they did so, and did so in hundreds of protest marches all over America during the war. And then I saw someone in the march proudly carrying the flag of the North Vietnamese, as illustrated in this photograph in the yellow rectangle to the right. They were carrying the flag of the enemy, the flag under which the enemy was killing American soldiers. And no one burned that flag. They were probably people watching who had family members fighting in this war, or who had learned that they had died in combat against those who carried this flag in battle. This was just after they burned the American flag right in front of me and the others on the curb. Then I learned after the march was over that they had committed acts of vandalism against some of the buildings at the beginning of their march. Now I started thinking about the entire thing after they had passed by. They had done everything they could to convince me and the others not to support their cause. Every one of these acts was intended to get me and the others to react against them and what they were doing. And I remembered two slogans that were made popular during the war itself. And it occurred to me that neither of these offered us a victory in the war. The first of these was, "Your country, right or wrong." It dawned on me that this was teaching America that you should support your government even when they were wrong by not committing this nation to a victory in Vietnam. We were to continue to support their no-win, no-victory position. There was no way we could protest and demand a victory and still love our country. Those of us who wanted a victory did not love our country. The second phrase was, "Love it or leave it." This meant that if you did not support your government in their no-win strategy, you should leave the country. Once again, you could not love your country if you demanded a victory from the planners. These slogans and the anti-war protesters were offering us only two options: support your country when it was wrong, or don't support your country by burning a flag, using profanity, doing acts of vandalism, and carrying the Viet Cong flag. Notice that victory was not an option. It was either one or two. The media did its bit in helping the no-victory forces as well. Every time two or more anti-war protesters got together to protest the war, the media was there. But when hundreds of thousands of people marched on Washington demanding a victory, the media was busy covering a bake sale at a local charity. But the most important thing to notice during the entirety of the war was that the government was actually creating the anti-war protest movement. Let me discuss this by using this illustration. There is one thing I know about paychecks. The name on the middle line is the employee, and the name on the bottom line is the boss. I kept getting paychecks during the course of the war. My name was on the middle line, and my boss's name was on the bottom line. And please notice that I got paid what I was worth. And as long as I did what the boss wanted, I kept getting paychecks. The name on the bottom line wanted me to make widgets, and as long as I made widgets, I kept getting paychecks. If I stopped making widgets or went to the front of my building with some of my fellow employees carrying signs like these, "I hate the boss is a pig, and don't buy the boss's product," none of us would get paychecks. During the Vietnamese War, the government universities were getting paychecks in the form of aid to the government schools. The university's name was on the middle line, and the boss's name was on the bottom line. That meant that the boss liked the product being turned out by the universities. They liked the anti-government protesters being produced by the anti-government universities. And they kept giving the universities paychecks all the time they were producing anti-government protesters. That product was students who hated the government. We've all heard the old adage, you get what you paid for. If you don't like the product being turned out by the universities, then don't pay them to turn out the product. As I said, if I didn't make the product my boss wanted, I got fired. But the universities never got fired. That must have meant they were doing what the government wanted. And what they were doing was to convince the American people to support the war with only two options. Support the war with no hope of victory, or hate the government. And it worked. It prolonged the war with no victory from 1964 to 1975. And that was because victory was not the goal of our government. This protest march that I had observed was northbound on Broadway, one of the main streets of downtown Portland. And one day I found a map of Portland, and I discovered one more clue that I was right. The march had originated on the campus of Portland State University at the end of the southern end of Broadway. And then they marched up Broadway right in front of the building I worked in. Portland State, I would presume, was getting federal aid to its schools, and it was turning out the product that the government wanted, anti-war, anti-government protesters. Remember, you get what you paid for. Let me ask you this. What sort of reaction would the soldiers in Vietnam have when they see a daily picture in the media of this that they are told is the typical American response to the war in Vietnam? I think it would lead them to frustration, thinking that if the American people did not support the war, why did the government send them there? I think there would be two words to describe their reaction: disillusion and frustration. And I am saying that this was by actual design of this conspiracy. And all of this happened during the entirety of the war. Because there was another goal of the war itself. So the only conclusion you can draw from all of this evidence is that the United States government committed this nation to a war that they did not want to win, but wanted to prolong. And it succeeded in the deaths of millions of people. The next question to be answered is this one. Why did America fight the war in Vietnam? The real reason we fought the war in Vietnam is drugs. Drugs. The purpose of the war in Vietnam was to create a drug culture in America. And the reason the planners selected Vietnam for this war was because drugs were plentiful in that area of the world. The planners knew that American soldiers would make a good living compared to the Vietnamese, and they could buy the low-cost drugs. And the American fighting men would turn to drugs as a way of dealing with their frustration of not being able to win a war that did not make sense. Why did the planners want to create a drug culture in the United States? Simply because Communist China needed American dollars to buy American war-making technology. And how were they going to pay for their purchases? By selling the only product they had that was available in large quantities. But America was not a market for this product before the war in Vietnam. So in one sentence, the conspirators needed to create a market so we could buy the drugs for Americans and pay for them with American dollars so that Communist China could buy war-making technology from America. Let me start by showing you that America started selling technology to Communist China around the presidency of Ronald Reagan. On June the 12th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan signed a presidential document called Presidential Determination Number 84-11. This is a copy of it. It read in part, I hereby find that the furnishing of defense articles and services to the government of China will strengthen the security of the United States and promote world peace. In 1983, Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of Defense in President Reagan's administration, visited Communist China. That is him on the Great Wall of China in the picture to the left. The article headline reads, Most technology open, Weinberger tells China. On January the 15th, 1986, the Los Angeles Times told the American people just what the Chinese were buying in the way of defense articles. Remote-controlled deck guns, gas turbine engines, sonar equipment, and torpedoes. The Communist Chinese system cannot feed their people, and we are not selling them foodstuffs like rice. We're selling them deck guns and torpedoes. Now the question is, what are they selling us to get dollars to buy this technology? And the answer is heroin. Heroin. This is a map of Communist China that shows in yellow the 9 million acres where the Chinese grow the poppies that are later processed into the heroin. This map partially explains why the Chinese cannot grow enough food to feed their own people. They're taking rich farmland to grow poppies for drug production. To show you just how significant this 9 million acre poppy field is, China has 15 million acres of land on which they grow their rice. Now, the American government has known about this drug cultivation since at least 1961. This is Stanton Cadlin, a drug expert who testified before a committee on the House of Representatives, and he told them, for the first time in human history, the systematic production and distribution of narcotic drugs has become an organized monopoly in Red China. In 10 years, Mao Zedong, at that time the head of the communist government in China, has built up a virtual monopoly in heroin. So our government knew that communist China was selling heroin to the world as far back as 1961. In fact, they could have known even further back in the past, back to 1956, when Rodney Gilbert in the National Review magazine wrote this: "There is no longer any doubt that Red China is by all odds the biggest contributor to the illicit traffic in opium and heroin." Mr. Harry Anslinger, the head of the United States Bureau of Narcotics, said this in 1961. "The Chinese Communist regime is directly responsible for the supply of at least 65% of the illicit narcotics trade. There is very definite proof that heroin smuggled in from Communist China is responsible for the rise of narcotic addiction in the United States." This is a picture of President Richard Nixon toasting before they eat a dinner with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese foreign minister. This man, along with Mao Zedong, murdered as many as 80 million Chinese in the bloody Chinese Communist Revolution between 1923 and 1949. That was greater than 1 in 10 Chinese. Yet here is America's president about to eat dinner with one of the two greatest mass murderers of all time. Zhou Enlai confirmed that Communist China was in the drug trade in 1965 during the war in Vietnam. This is what he said: "The more troops the U.S. sends to Vietnam, the happier we shall be. Some of the American soldiers are trying opium, and we are helping them. We are planting the best kinds of opium, especially for Americans." Notice that he said that their drugs were being grown, especially for the American soldiers in Vietnam. This is a picture of the opium produced in Communist China that appeared in the U.S. News and World Report of July the 5th, 1993. That's here, but here in this picture, rather, the authorities are destroying the drugs. Notice that in this close-up, you will see that the block of opium is stamped with the number 999 on it. But for students of the Bible, when you flip the picture over, it says the number is 666, the number of the beast in the book of Revelation. Isn't that an interesting coincidence? Now, I want to break the train of thought for just a moment and show you a quote that shows just how greedy and immoral those who dealt in this opium and heroin business were. This is Colonel Bogarts, a retired American Green Beret officer in Vietnam. He wrote a book entitled Call to Serve, and on page 375, he told his readers this horrendous story. "It blew my mind to learn that a group of morticians were concealing their shipments of drugs to the United States in the body cavities of dead American soldiers during the Vietnamese War." I have to admit that that story did not startle me because I knew that this conspiracy was that evil, but it showed me just how merciless these drug dealers were. I agree with Colonel Wright when he said in his book that this is an unthinkable thought. But this is what we are talking about in our study of the war in Vietnam. Now let me explain how this drug trade works. The United States sends the money to Communist China, and China sends the drugs to the United States. The United States sends the technology to Communist China, and the Chinese communists send the American dollars back to the United States to pay for their purchase. And both sides are happy with the transaction. And then the process starts all over again. I would now like to show you the evidence that the government of the United States knows that this money is being used to buy drugs from Communist China. This is once again Colonel Bo Gritz. By the way, just notice that he has a chest full of medals because he was a heavily decorated Vietnam veteran. He has a story to tell that is interesting and extremely pertinent to the story I'm relating during this presentation. In 1989, Colonel Bo Gritz came to Tucson and spoke to a group that I belonged to. He told us about a trip he took to Burma in 1986 at the specific request of the United States government. He wrote about this trip in his second book entitled A Nation Betrayed. He reported that President George Bush the father had received a report that a man named Kun Sa in Burma had information on 3 American prisoners of war in the jungles of Burma, and Bo was asked to go into the area to meet with him to discuss how he could bring back these 3 POWs to America. Bo said that he was told that he learned Kun Sa was the head of a 5 million people called the Shan, and that they lived in a corner of Burma, Vietnam, and Communist China, shown here in the blue loop. These people are not a formal nation because they do not care about national borders, they just live in the jungle. So Bo went to Burma in 1986 and met with Kun Sa. This is a picture of them as they met and talked in Kun Sa's jungle headquarters. Kun Sa told Bo that he had no knowledge about any POWs in his area, but that Bo was free to travel anywhere in his territories, and if he found any POWs, he was free to take them with him. Bo did that, but could find no evidence of any prisoners of war in Kun Sa's territory. But Kun Sa had something more important that he wanted to tell Bo. He reported that he and the Shan people were in the drug business. He admitted that they started selling drugs in 1950. Kun Sa told him that he received the raw poppies grown in Communist China and then refined them into heroin. They discussed just how much heroin he produced. He told Bo that it was 900 tons in 1986, and later on Bo learned that it was 1,200 tons in 1988, 2,200 tons in 1989, and 3,200 tons in 1991. He told Bo that he sold the heroin for $1,500 a pound. Just how much money would he collect for the sale of 3,200 tons? Obviously, unimaginable amounts of money. Kun Sa has a 40,000-man army, and Bo said he considered them to be an excellent one, well-trained and equipped. Kun Sa admitted that he operated 12 refineries scattered throughout the jungles near the border of Thailand and Burma. But the amazing thing he told Bo was that he wanted to get out of the drug business. He wanted to stop growing, refining, and moving tons of heroin and opium through his area. He wanted the American government to provide the Shan people with another crop or business. he wanted to feed his people with something other than drug money. He told Bo that Coonsaw's area is rich in teakwood, rubies, gold, and jade, but that he needed American assistance in marketing any or all of these products. Bo was elated. He wrote, "I was certain our government would be excited about Coonsaw's offer. But," he said, "I couldn't have been more wrong." There was a war against drugs being waged in America to stop the use of drugs by some of the American people. And here was an offer to stop most of the opium and heroin from going into America. Coonsaw told Colonel Greitz that he would be willing to name 3 buyers of the drugs to assist the United States in knowing that he was sincere in his offer. The first individual he named was Santos Trafficani, the mafia chief of Miami, Florida. You might expect the mafia to be involved in the drug business, so this name came as no surprise to me. But the next 2 names shocked me. The second name was Theodore Shackley, CIA Deputy Director for Covert Operations. The CIA was buying drugs in collusion with the mafia. And the third name was Richard Armitage, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Coonsaw was saying that the American government and the mafia were partners in the drug business. Bo brought home a total of 44 hours of tape interviews with Coonsaw and his assistants, and the papers signed by them indicating that they wanted out of the drug business. He turned these papers and tapes over to the United States government and to the Congress in December of 1986. He was told by Tom Harvey, the National Security Administration's staff assistant, that there is no interest here in doing that, meaning that the American government had no interest in stopping the importation of heroin drugs into this country. But that was expected. Coonsaw warned Bo that George Bush, meaning the father, is not likely to support our plan, because too many of his associates were involved in the drug business. Now let's see if that statement is true. Where was George Bush from January 1976 to January 1977? He was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but you say that he did not know that the CIA was buying drugs. When Caspar Weinberger left as Secretary of Defense at the end of the Reagan administration, he was quoted as saying, "If you don't know what is going on in your department, you shouldn't be in charge." And to show you that George Bush should have known, U.S. News and World Report called him one of the best directors the CIA ever had. That means he must have known. Good directors know what their departments are doing, and George Bush was one of the best. In fact, George Bush has had a long association with the CIA. According to this article, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, said that George Bush worked for the CIA since 1963. Now, where was George Bush before he's director of the CIA? From October of 1974 to January of 1976, a total of 16 months, he was America's envoy to China, meaning he was the #1 representative of our government in that nation. Notice that he was not called our ambassador because the United States had not officially recognized the Communist Chinese government as yet. But notice that he was America's #1 representative in the country that was selling the drugs being brought into the United States. But I am certain that he did not know that China was growing 9 million acres of poppies. I'm certain that not one person in China told him, nor did he ever hear one tiny rumor of that fact. I would now like to show you two pictures of George Bush and his wife Barbara taken while they were in China. This picture was taken in Tiananmen Square, where years later thousands of Chinese students would protest the lack of personal freedom in China, and some would be crushed by the Communist Chinese army. Notice two things. First, they were riding bicycles because there are few private automobiles in China. This appears to be an attempt to show the Chinese people that the new envoy and his wife were simple country people. But more importantly, notice the strategic placing of the photograph of Mao Tse-tung between the two of them. That picture is nearly centered, as if they wanted the portrait in their picture. Mao was one of the two greatest mass murderers in the history of the world, and the Bushes just happened to get his picture centered in their photograph. Now, I am certain that you are saying that this is just a coincidence. And I'm making too much out of a picture of Mao being centered between the two Bushes, because you're saying it's just a coincidence. They just stopped to have their picture taken in a famous square in China, and it just so happened to be taken with Mao in the middle of it. Then how do you explain this picture taken just a few minutes later from another position, probably 100 feet or more away? Notice that the picture of Mao is still between the two Bushes. Yes, I know, both pictures were taken, and it just so happened that Mao's picture was in the center. But it is possible that they were doing this to show that they truly admired this man as being a great figure in Chinese history, the murderer of 80 million Chinese. Please write to me with your opinion as to why the Bushes had two pictures taken of them with this butcher in their picture. I'd love to hear your views. But it is possible that they did it for exactly this reason. When Mao died in September of 1976, President Gerald Ford said, Mao was a great figure in modern Chinese history. The president, for some reason, failed to mention that Mao was indeed the great murderer of 80 million Chinese. Former President Richard Nixon described Mao as a unique man in a generation of great revolutionary leaders. I guess that Nixon feels that unique men murder 80 million people. The New York Times of September 10, 1976, called Chairman Mao a statesman and above all a moralist. Apparently, the murder of 80 million people is the act of a great moralist. David Rockefeller, long a supporter of leftist causes, said this after he made a visit to China in 1973. Whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, 80 million dead, it has obviously succeeded not only in producing a more efficient and dedicated administration, but in also fostering high morale and community of interest. So it is certainly conceivable that George Bush agreed with these sources that Mao was a great human being and posed for these pictures knowing that the portrait of this great human being, this moralist, was centered in these pictures. By the way, you might remember this photograph as being one that I suggested you remember for a reason that I would discuss later. Is it possible that Bill Clinton was using this photograph as a way of saying that he respected Ho Chi Minh, who's shown in that portrait or that statue behind him, like these men respected Mao Tse-tung? It could quite possibly put a whole different light on Clinton's picture, maybe. However, to be fair to the New York Times, they quoted a young Chinese on the island of Taiwan off the Chinese coast when he said this: Mao was a monster, not a human being. And that he, this young man, mourned for all the lives he took, all the suffering he caused the Chinese people. I will let you decide which of these comments said it best. I would like to return to the story of Colonel Bo Gritz and his discovery of the Chinese drug connection. When he returned to the United States after his second trip to Burma to meet with Khun Sa, he was arrested by the United States government for a misuse of a passport. Bo was found innocent after a jury trial. William Maddox, the U.S. attorney who prosecuted Bo, was interviewed by the local press on April the 21st, 1989, after the trial. Bo had copied this interview on his video that he sells, and you can watch him say this yourself. You watch the video. Mr. Maddox says, George Bush called me and told me to get Bo Gritz. A few days after Mr. Maddox gave this public interview, he was fired by the U.S. government. I don't mean to laugh, Mr. Maddox, I'm sorry. Was this prosecution or persecution? Does this sound like justice or vengeance? It has to be vengeance against both Colonel Gritz and Mr. Maddox, because both of these men knew that the American government was buying drugs from the communist government in China, and that this American war on drugs is a farce. On March the 16th, 1990, the United States government indicted Khun Sa. They called him the leading drug trafficker in Southeast Asia, but the government admitted that they could not arrest him because of his 40,000-man army. So it appears that they could not get Khun Sa to stop his drug trafficking activities. However, the government did go after another major drug dealer in the world, Manuel Noriega of the nation of Panama. It has been estimated that at the time he was arrested, 75% of all the world's cocaine came from Colombia and went through the nation of Panama. He was charged on February the 5th, 1988 with drug smuggling, amongst other charges, and found guilty in 8 of those 10 counts. But Noriega made the claim that he had worked for the CIA of the United States. The headline reads, CIA wanted drugs, guns to flow, Noriega says. This August 23, 1991, Pittsburgh Press newspaper reported that Noriega says he had good reason for allowing drugs and guns to slip through Panama. The last seven CIA directors, including George Bush, the father, asked him to help with the drugs. In August of 1988, President Ronald Reagan ordered the State Department, the Defense Department, and the Central Intelligence Agency not to cooperate with the congressional investigation of possible illegal activities of General Manuel Noriega of Panama. The article reported that the investigation could touch on politically sensitive matters, such as when George Bush the father learned that Noriega might be involved in drug trafficking. And on February the 19th, 1992, the Star reported that George Bush's chief of staff testified that Bush knew about Noriega's drug laundering operations in 1983, far earlier than the president has acknowledged. On February the 20th, 1992, the Star reported that George Bush kept Noriega on the CIA payroll in the 1970s when he directed the agency and met with him personally. But Bush has said that he knew nothing of Noriega's alleged drug dealings until shortly before February of 1988. But on page 60 of his book entitled A Nation Betrayed, Bo Gritz reports that he first had information about Noriega's drug dealings while he, meaning Bo, was stationed in Panama in 1976. Bo wrote, I was commanding special forces in Latin America, and we had information that Noriega was a drug smuggler. Noriega was directly responsible for massive amounts of illegal drugs being funneled through Panama into the United States. We reported this through our intelligence sources. Bo reported that just a short time after he sent this information up the chain of command through his intelligence connections, a general came to him in Panama and told him, "You must keep your hands completely off of Noriega. He has immense value at the highest levels." Bo stated George Bush was head of the CIA at the time, meaning he had immense value to George Bush, the highest level of the CIA. And Bo went on, "I could not understand how or why we would allow a conduit for drugs into America to continue." Let me summarize what we've just learned. Bogarts knew that Noriega was on the CIA payroll while he was a major drug dealer, and he was told that Noriega had immense value at the highest level, and he was told this in 1976. So if all of these articles are correct, these 5 presidents are the biggest drug dealers in the world: George Bush, Ronald Reagan, Jimmy Carter, Gerald Ford, and Richard Nixon. This so-called war on drugs is a fraud. I would like to continue my discussion of Colonel Bogarts' knowledge of the drug-running activities of Manuel Noriega. Let's examine the knowledge of President George Bush to see if we can find some evidence that he knew that the American government was paying Manuel Noriega to be a cocaine dealer in Panama. Let's ask the question, did George Bush personally know Noriega? This is a picture of them taken in 1983, and it shows George Bush sitting just a few feet away from Manuel Noriega. Please notice that the year of this meeting was 1983. This is another picture of George Bush while he was vice president. The caption says that George Bush had known of no evidence that General Noriega was involved in drug trafficking before the Panamanians' indictment in February of 1988. Quote, however, administration sources, officials say Bush was informed 3 years ago of the general's drug ties. So apparently George Bush wants us to believe that he and Noriega met to talk about their mutual love of hamburgers. Notice Colonel Greitz told us that Noriega had immense value at the highest level and that he told that to the Army intelligence in 1976. And George Bush was Vice President of the United States in 1983. Would you not agree with me that that is in the highest level? Wikipedia on the internet tells us that, quote, during his tenure as vice president, Bush headed administration task forces on fighting drug abuse, end quote. So the question is, when did George Bush learn of Noriega's drug dealings? Was it 1988, 85, 83, or 1976? But more importantly, why would he deny it? This is a very strange photograph indeed. Notice what George Bush has said. I was in China, but I didn't know they were in the drug business. I was head of the CIA, but I didn't know that Noriega and the Red Chinese were in the drug business. I knew Manuel Noriega, but I didn't know he was in the drug business. I was head of President Reagan's drug eradication program while I was vice president, but I didn't know Communist China and Panama were in the drug business. Yet this man became the President of the United States. All of the evidence presented so far says that the United States government is the biggest drug dealer in the world. And George Bush doesn't know that. I would now like to return to this nation's war on drugs and how it affects our present and also our future. This drug war in the United States is very selective. Our government arrests one drug dealer but not another. It makes deals with one drug dealer but not another. On July the 18th, 1989, the USA Today newspaper reported that drug czar William Bennett proposed that the American government link foreign aid to Colombia, a major source of the cocaine that comes into the United States, to new drug eradication programs, including incentives to introduce peasant farmers to new crops. Notice Colombia drug dealers were to get drug eradication programs, but the growers of the poppies that become heroin produced by the Sean government of Kunsa do not. The drug growers of Colombia who produce cocaine did not want out of the drug business, but our drug eradication program forced them out. And we can then give them a crop substitution program. Kunsa says that the Sean people who produce heroin want out of the drug business voluntarily, and we cannot provide them with a drug or crop substitution program. This is a very strange war on drugs, and we must ask the question, why? And here is the answer. The government of the United States was shutting down the cocaine drug trade through Colombia and Panama and increasing the drug trade in heroin. Why? To make heroin the drug of choice in America. The government's war on drugs was replacing cocaine with the preferred drug, heroin. And I started saying this back in the mid-1980s. And that poses a second question. Why was heroin the drug of choice? And the answer is to keep the dollars flowing into communist China. Finally, on June the 19th, 1991, the Tucson Citizen newspaper reported, heroin making comeback, low prices, large supply, spur sales. So drug users were using heroin instead of cocaine. And I repeat, the end result is more dollars to communist China. Now let me show you that our government knew that America was buying drugs from Kunsa, who was processing the poppies into heroin for the Chinese communists. On January the 18th, 1989, President Ronald Reagan awarded about 25 people a Citizens Award for their service to the country. The name in the middle on the right is Richard Armitage, the purchaser of drugs from Kunsa. President Ronald Reagan gave Mr. Armitage a medal for his service to this country in being a drug dealer. Later, on February the 27th, 1989, President George Bush named Richard Armitage as a Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific affairs. You do a great job in service for your country, and you receive a medal and then get a promotion, even if you are a drug dealer. I would next like to tell you another story, but I must admit that I have no way of checking it out. I have no intelligence gathering network to confirm this story, but I did meet with this individual and talk to him and ask the pertinent questions. And I am convinced that what he told me is true for the simple reason it fits all of the material I've been able to check out. So I will just report the story as he relayed it to me, and I will not name this individual to protect his privacy. In 1989, when Bogarts came to Tucson to speak to the club I was a member of, a young man in his combat fatigue from his days in the American Air Force came and told me stood beside me at the back of the room. After Bo had concluded his remarks, this young man said rather loudly, "Bo, I can confirm what you've been telling these people today about America being in the drug business in Southeast Asia." He went on, "I worked at the Utapao airfield in Thailand between 1966 and 1974. First as an employee of a CIA front corporation and then as a member of the Air Force. For 8 years I loaded the heroin off of the mules that came from Kunsa and loaded it onto Air America airplanes for shipment to the United States." Now this is Ralph here. I never heard of the Air America Airlines in 1989, but later in 1991 I took this photograph of 2 of their airplanes in Tucson, waiting apparently for some reconditioning work here in Tucson. Notice that the words on the side do not say American Airlines, they say Air America. Here is some additional evidence that he might be telling the truth. This is a movie entitled Air America that was produced in August of 1990 starring Mel Gibson. The headline reads in its entirety, "Air America crashes in with a nasty emptiness," meaning the reviewer didn't like the movie. The review of the movie said this: "They, meaning Air America, transport heroin to finance the CIA's operations." So I asked this young man if he would mind telling me the rest of his story, and he agreed, so we met privately later that afternoon. He told me that in about 1970, he and his fellow Americans working there were told that an American congressman had landed in one of Air America's airplanes, and they went over to see who it was. The congressman was in the co-pilot seat and was George Herbert Walker Bush, a future president of the United States. It is known that Congressman Bush was a pilot during World War II. The young man's recollection of the date of this visit in 1970 could be correct, because the Wikipedia encyclopedia on the internet says that George Bush was a congressman from January the 3rd of 1967 to January the 3rd of 1971. He said that he and some other Americans working at the airfield had lunch with the congressman. I asked him if he believed that Congressman Bush knew that they were loading heroin into an Air America airplane just beside the one he landed at, and his answer was, "There is no question in my mind that he knew. In fact, we loaded his airplane before he took off to fly back to America." So now we know that President George Bush knew all about America being directly involved in the drug business, since at least he was a congressman back in 1970. Let me now bring you one more story that seems to confirm all of what these people are saying about our involvement in Vietnam. In 1990, I gave a version of this speech in Long Beach, California. After I concluded my remarks, a man in the audience stood up and said he could confirm some of the details mentioned in my lecture. He said that one of his best friends, a major in the United States Army, came back from Vietnam and told him that part of his job during the war was to take American money to Burma and to give it to the drug sellers. Once again, you will have to decide for yourself about the truth of all of these stories as a jury member. This is another newspaper article that adds more evidence to that which I've already accumulated in all of my research. It is a story that appeared in the September 4th, 1991 Green Valley News and Sun newspaper in Green Valley, Arizona, a city south of Tucson. It described the speech that retired Lieutenant Colonel Bernard Robinson gave, in which he described the activities during a part of the Vietnam War. He was the military advisor to the Lao fighting forces fighting in the Vietnamese War. The headline reads, Robinson shares his insights on secret war in Laos. It quoted the colonel as saying, the chief of staff of the Lao Army was authorized by the U.S. to conduct a drug trade during his time there. So once again, we see that drugs played an important part in the Vietnamese War. Next, I would like to return to the story about Kun Saw and his involvement in the drug trade. Are there any evidences that Kun Saw was involved in providing drugs for the American government? Was he involved? Let's look at some evidence. And this article will provide some of that additional evidence. In the 1960s, the CIA adopted Kun Saw. To ensure his loyalty, CIA operatives allowed the tribes to transport their opium, and I'm putting in there in heroin as well, as you'll see, to South Vietnam, where 20,000 GIs became heroin addicts by the early 1970s. Let me read that again. In the 1960s, the CIA adopted Kun Saw. To ensure his loyalty, CIA operatives allowed the tribes to transport their opium and heroin to South Vietnam, where 20,000 GIs became heroin addicts by the early 1970s. So here we learn that heroin was not only going to America to create a drug culture, some of it was going to South Vietnam to get some of the American fighting men addicted to heroin and or opium. In other words, and I repeat myself, the war on drugs is a fraud. Now it is time to tell what I consider to be the most important part of this entire war scenario in Vietnam. I would like you to know that I personally believe this story to be true as well. I first read about it in a newsletter I read years ago, and I called the person named in the story, and we talked over the phone for about an hour. I asked him if he would permit me to tape the conversation, and he consented. I've used this tape and all of the other writings of his other writings on the subject to detail what I'm about to relay to you now. Because this is a story of how one man who got the support of two more individuals, one man and these two, ended the war in Vietnam years before it was supposed to end. I'd like to remind you once again, please be a member of a jury and be open. Please hear all of what I'm about to tell you before you decide whether or not this man's story is true. Here are the brief details of what he told me. It was known that at least 80% of the war-making technology entered North Vietnam through one port, the port of Haiphong. As you can see, the port is near the Gulf of Tonkin and is the only port in this nation deep enough to allow ocean-going vessels to enter the area and unload their cargo. This is an article that shows just how important the port is. It says that there were 36 ships in the harbor at one time, meaning this must have been a huge port, well capable of handling huge cargoes of war-making technology. This is the small map of North Vietnam, again showing the city of Haiphong in the lower right. The blue line leading off into the northwest is called the Red River, and it is called this because it is very muddy, carrying tons of mud into the port each day. The North Vietnamese have purchased a dredge that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, removing the mud which clogs the port. This is an actual photograph of the dredge, and I will tell you how I know that a little later. Now, any general who wants to win a war knows that the way to win is by cutting off the supplies of your enemy. And when you know that 80% of the enemy supplies come through one port, and that this port has a dredge to keep the port open, it would follow that it is imperative to sink the dredge to allow the port to silt up, and the enemy then would have no way of getting the supplies necessary to kill American fighting forces. You could end this war by silting up the harbor of Haiphong, but this never happened. The American government made no attempt to sink the dredge. These are the Pentagon Papers, which were commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in 1967 and were made public in 1971. They were released by Daniel Ellsberg, a top military analyst who became disillusioned with the Pentagon's war policy. They were classified top secret at the time, and Anthony Russo assisted in their release. This article discusses his action and was published upon his death. They report that the planners started talking about the mining or the blockading of the port of Haiphong in 1954, about the time that President Eisenhower sent military advisors into South Vietnam. This is page 445, and it says that the closure of Haiphong was not acceptable because they concluded that the closure of the port was bound to risk a confrontation with communist Russia. See, if we get them mad, they would send war-making technology to the enemy, and then they would send missiles and soldiers into the war with instructions to fire at American airplanes. And we certainly don't want that to happen, even though it did. And we didn't blockade the port of Haiphong. In 2002, I met a retired Navy officer who was a medical doctor assigned to the Ticonderoga aircraft carrier. He reported to me that he observed that the pilots on board were being trained to drop mines in the harbor of Haiphong. He said this was sometime between 1963 and 1965, just around the time that Lyndon Johnson lied to us about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But there were some who decided to close the port, and then the war would come to a hasty conclusion. In March of 1968, Science and Mechanics magazine interviewed 9 top retired military officers in all 3 branches of the military. And they unanimously concluded the war can be won in 6 weeks. They concluded that there were 4 things to do to win the war. Number 1, officially declare war on North Vietnam. This would commit the entire resources of the United States to a victory. The United States never declared war against North Vietnam. Number 2, destroy all targets of consequence. As we've already seen, this was certainly not being done during the war. Number 3, warn Communist China and Communist Russia to halt all shipments of war supplies to North Vietnam, and as we've already seen, this also was never done. And number 4, close the port of Haiphong, and this wasn't done either. These retired military officers knew that the way to win any war was to cut off the supplies of the enemy. And in the case of the Vietnam War, that port was Haiphong. Apparently only retired military officers were able to figure that out. Civilian policy planners cannot be expected to think of these very, very complex solutions on their own. And notice this, if you close the port of Haiphong, you wouldn't have to do the other 3 things. The war would be over. So the solution to a war is simply, you win a war by winning it. You do those things that will give your troops a victory at the lowest possible cost in human life. And the way to do this in the Vietnam War was to sink one dredge. But some military officers on active duty did figure it out. Admiral U.S. Grant Sharp, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, said, "We should have closed the harbor of Haiphong." This was a great mistake, of course, and immeasurably increased the casualties that our side suffered. The failure to close the port killed American fighting forces. These are harsh words, but they are extremely accurate. In 1968, General Wheeler, a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, submitted a bombing policy paper. Senator Barry Goldwater reported on what that paper said. General Wheeler would favor action to close the port of Haiphong. Then Goldwater told us why President Johnson did not carry out General Wheeler's recommendation. The general had received word that closing the port was not an option or an action Johnson was going to consider. And this becomes the question. Why did Johnson not close the port? And the answer is, as I've been saying during this presentation, because victory was not an option in the war. We were not in this war to win it. In a book about Air Force General Curtis LeMay, entitled Iron Eagle, the author tells us what General LeMay would have done to win the war. He would have mined the harbor of Haiphong. Now the next question must be this one. Why didn't these top military officers not do this while they were on active duty during the war? They had the power. The armed forces know that when admirals and generals speak, others obey. But most people do not know that generals and admirals take orders as well. Article 2, Section 2 says, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. That means that the President issues orders to admirals and generals, and they know that they had best obey them. Presidents and not generals or admirals are the ones who decide to sink dredges. And who were the commanders-in-chief during the war? There were two. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. Finally, on May the 8th, 1972, President Nixon took steps to end the war. He went on nationwide television and told the American people, there is only one way to stop the killing, and that is to keep the weapons out of North Vietnam. And how did Nixon propose to keep the weapons out of North Vietnam? He announced plans to drop mines into the port of Haiphong. But notice there is an even bigger question to ask. Why did it take him nearly 4 years to take this action? Why in 1972? And not in 1971, 1970, or 1969 when he was inaugurated as president? And notice this, President Nixon did not seem too concerned that this action would provoke a nuclear confrontation with Communist Russia. And if he should have been, nothing happened. The Soviet Union did not increase their involvement in the war because he closed down the port, and they didn't threaten us with a nuclear war. Remember that this was the reason that the government planners had issued the rules of engagement and had not closed the port before 1972. So Nixon then warned the nations with ships in the port that they had 4 days to get their ships out of the port before he dropped the mines. Which nations did he notify? Why, of course, the two nations of Communist Russia and then Communist China, because they had ships in the harbor. For instance, here's a photograph of a Russian ship unloading materials, in this case trucks, in the Haiphong harbor, for example. And then he notified all of the other communist nations who were aiding communist North Vietnam in the war by carrying war-making goods into North Vietnam. This war was very simple. It was a war between the communist nations against the capitalist nations of the United States and its allies. So these other nations had chosen up sides and had sided with their fellow communist nations. So Nixon sent notice to these communist nations to get their ships out of the port. They had 4 days. The communist nations were England, Japan, Greece, Norway, Italy, and West Germany. These nations were the other communist nations who had decided to support the war effort of their fellow communist nations instead of the United States. This is a list of some of those nations and the names of the ships that were being used to ship goods to kill Americans. This, for instance, is the list of the 15 Norwegian ships which visited Haiphong to unload goods to kill Americans. But these nations were not our enemy, they were our ally. Who needs enemies when you have friends like these? Now, there was one more communist nation that had its ship in the port of Haiphong, and President Nixon had to warn this nation as well. One more communist nation supporting the enemy in killing Americans. That nation was the communist nation of the United States. You might remember that we discussed Professor Sutton when we studied America's military aid to the Soviet Union. As part of that research, he looked into all of the Russian ships sailing into the port of Haiphong during the Vietnamese War. He identified over 100 of their ships, including 5 Liberty ships that had been lent to Communist Russia during World War II that had ended about 19 years before. This is a photograph that shows one of the last Liberty ships somewhere on the Sacramento River in California in a mothball fleet being kept so that it could be used again in a war emergency. The United States built hundreds of these ships to a common plan to quickly get ships into the water to carry goods to our troops in World War II. But the United States lent Russia 121 merchant vessels, presumably Liberty ships. The program was called Lend-Lease. These ships were not gifts. They were either lent or leased to the communist nation of Russia, which means that these ships were flying the Russian flag and were being used to carry goods into Haiphong to kill Americans. And they still legally belonged to the United States. I can remember reading about some people who were warning the American government about this Lend-Lease program during World War II, that it could come back to haunt the American people. And here's some evidence that it did come back to us a few years later. By the way, should you wish to see a list of the goods that this $11 billion Lend-Lease program sent Russia, you can on pages 83 to 108 in this book entitled From Major Jordan's Diaries. But during World War II, the communist nation of Russia was our ally. How could we have known that it would turn against us in the Vietnamese War? And the answer is simple. They are a communist nation, and communist nations are out to destroy the capitalist system. So they were doing what they were expected to do, and that was kill American soldiers. So on May the 8th, 1972, Richard Nixon announced the plans to end the war in Vietnam. The bloody war was coming to an end. But it is an interesting question as to why he chose that particular day. Because it was not Nixon who ended the war. Neither was it Henry Kissinger. Neither was it Congress. Neither was it the media. Neither was it the anti-war protesters. One man did, and this is that man. Nord Davis of Topton, North Carolina. Mr. Davis learned about the dredge in the port of Haiphong in 1971 and decided it was the key to a victory in Vietnam. He decided to conduct a private war against the dredge since the government would not do so. He decided to sink the dredge and end the war in Vietnam. He raised $100,000 and offered it as a payment to any American pilot who would sink the dredge himself. He printed up thousands of these flyers and had them delivered to American Air Force bases in Vietnam. It told the pilot that if he would sink the dredge and then be able to prove it with photographs, he would receive the $100,000 in cash. Mr. Davis said that hundreds of pilots called him for further information, and he told me that he told them that all of them could end the war and that they could go home earlier if they would sink it. And the typical response was that the port of Haiphong and the dredge were not on the approved target list. And in fact, it was specifically off limits to fly over. And if he sank the dredge, he would violate the rules of engagement. And if he did that, he would be subject to a court-martial. And if he was court-martialed, he would lose his pension. And then if he lost his pension, he would have no future. And Mr. Davis would then explain that if you sank the dredge, it would end the war, and countless lives of American fighting men would be saved. And maybe one of those lives saved would be yours. And hundreds of pilots stated that it was not enough money. And I find this response to be absolutely incredible. These pilots refused to do what was right after they learned what the solution to the war was. Finally, on December of 1971, a retired Army colonel named Grenville Rideout called Mr. Davis and asked if he would get the money if he sank the dredge. Colonel Rideout was a retired Vietnam veteran who spoke Vietnamese, and he could get into Haiphong and do as requested. Mr. Davis asked him how he would sink the dredge, and he explained that he would swim out to the dredge and plant timed explosives that would sink it after he swam away. Mr. Davis said that he would gladly give him the $100,000 if he could prove that he sank the dredge. So Colonel Rideout went to Haiphong and took this photograph of the actual dredge. He saw that this dredge was huge and became suspicious that one man could not carry enough explosives to effect a sinking. So he returned to the United States and did a little research on the very vessel itself. He found out that it was one of three, all of equal size, made by a company in Singapore. One of these dredges was in place in the port of Singapore, and the other one was in Hong Kong. So the colonel went to Singapore and met with the builders of the three dredges to learn more about the dredge itself. He told them he was a Florida land developer and that he needed a similar dredge to open up a harbor for a marina he wanted to build. The builders brought out the plans for the dredge and laid them on a table. Colonel Rideout learned that the dredge had 8 watertight compartments and that one man could not sink the dredge by himself. He returned to North Carolina and told Mr. Davis what he had learned. Rideout then explained that the only way it could be sunk was by bombing it. Nord Davis explained that he had tried that approach and that no American pilot was willing to assume the task of sinking the dredge. The colonel then told Mr. Davis that he knew where 2 B-25 attack bombers were sitting in some airport in Thailand. The B-25 was a World War II low-level bomber, meaning it could be flown low to the ground to avoid radar detection. These two airplanes had been given to Thailand by the government of the United States to assist them in some sort of drug war, and that he thought they could be purchased on auction. The colonel went to the Thai government and purchased each of the two planes for $500 apiece. So Nord Davis and the colonel now owned an Air Force. The two of them worked out the details of the attack. The plans called for the two planes, one after the other, to fly on the route shown on this map. The planes would leave Thailand on the left, fly due east across Laos into the Gulf of Tonkin, and then fly north and then northwest into the port. Each bomber would make one pass and hope that one or both could sink the dredge. They knew that they couldn't keep their planes staying around and keep flying around, making repeated bombing runs until they sank it. So they decided that each airplane would have to carry one bomb each, capable of sinking it by itself. The plan further stated that the second plane would take off 45 minutes after the first, unless the first had sunk the dredge. They planned on making the run between the 1st and 7th of May, 1972, because there would be a quarter moon out and that its light would assist the low-level bombers in seeing the target. They discovered that the United States Air Force did have a bomb that could be capable of sinking the dredge by itself, and it was called a 500-pound bomb. The colonel said that he knew a retired Marine Corps general named Pedro Del Valle, and that he might be able to assist them in getting the two 500-pound bombs to the airport in Thailand. He then called the general and explained the plan to him. The general said he would assist by seeing if he could obtain the bombs by calling generals in the Air Force in Vietnam who were friends of his, and he did. But all of the generals turned General Del Valle down because they said that they could not transport bombs to an airport in a neutral nation. It was about this time that they learned that even if they could get the bombs, the doors of the bomb bay of the B-25 that would have to be opened to drop the bombs were too small to allow the passage of the bombs to the target, and that the planes would need to be widened, and that would have to be done on each plane. They were this close, and they could not complete the job. And then General Del Valle said that they should bluff the government by claiming that they would sink the dredge, they meaning Nord Davis, the colonel, and the general, if the U.S. did not, and then hope that this would force the United States into sinking it. General Del Valle said that he knew Admiral John McCain, the father of Arizona Senator John McCain, who was the commander of all of the naval forces in the Pacific Fleet. Del Valle wrote a letter asking the admiral to meet with Colonel Rideout as a personal favor to him. And on April the 28th, 1972, Rideout flew to Hawaii, where Admiral McCain was headquartered, and met with his aide. Mr. Davis told me that the admiral did not meet directly with the colonel, so that he could deny, presumably, that he had ever talked to the colonel if this story had become public. Colonel Rideout told the aide that if they knew about the dredge in the port of Haiphong, and that if the United States Air Force did not sink it by May the 7th, 1972, they had the ability to do it themselves. And if they sunk the dredge, they would go public with the information that the U.S. government would not sink it, and that it took 3 American citizens to do the job, and that would not look good to the Air Force or the Navy or good to the American people. Colonel Rideout returned to the United States and met with Mr. Davis and General Del Valle. Nord told him that he had friends in the Pentagon and that Admiral McCain called Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and relayed what he had been told. He then explained that he, meaning Nord Davis, he was told that Mr. Kissinger had obtained the colonel's Army records and discovered that the colonel was highly recommended as an officer who did what he said he would do. So Kissinger apparently believed that there must be truth to his claim that he and the others would sink the dredge if the United States government did not do so. And he must have told President Nixon. And as I said, on May the 8th, 1972, President Nixon announced plans to drop mines into the harbor of Haiphong to effectively end that war. He went on national television and told the American people he was doing this to end the killing of the war. Nord sent me a newsletter entitled The Reaper, printed by an Air Force pilot stationed at Colorado Springs, Colorado, who told him that on May the 8th, 1972, when President Nixon announced the plans on dropping the mines into the port of Haiphong, the pilot said that the Air Force went to DEFCON 3, an increase in force readiness above normal. That response reportedly included a 24-hour alert on the Air Force to watch for any planes flying into the area of Haiphong. They were further ordered to shoot down any unauthorized plane in that vicinity. Notice that May the 8th in Haiphong may very well be May the 7th in Washington, D.C. So if all of this is true, they were meeting the deadline of Nord Davis, Colonel Rideout, and General Del Valle. So it was this one man, with the assistance of two retired military officers, ended the war. And that man was Nord Davis from Topton, North Carolina. And America owns this very courageous and innovative American patriot an enormous debt of gratitude, because he ended a war that probably was planned by the American government to go on for many years after this event. He had saved the lives of countless people in the area. So the bloody war was coming to an end, and on January the 23rd, 1973, the armistice was signed. Let me put all of this together with this article that appeared in the November 14, 1990 Willits, California newspaper. The Vietnam War was one big lie, declared George Dorner, who spent 32 months in Vietnam. Dorner said that the shots that were supposed to be fired at American ships in the Gulf of Tonkin never happened. Dorner added, "They got us in with a lie. They kept us there with lies, and they lied to us when we got out." Mr. Dorner has figured it out. Mr. Dorner is right. I have been providing evidence that to the American people since at least 1992 that certain members of the American government intentionally and knowingly murdered 58,000 American fighting men and women in Vietnam and countless others from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And that is what I call premeditated murder. One of the few who dared question the motives of those who planned and then carried out the war was General Robert Scott, who was quoted as saying, "Nowhere in all of history can a parallel be found where a nation has subsidized its own mortal enemies. It cannot be all accidental." And may I add that it wasn't all accidental. This was a deliberate policy of those who did not want to win a war that they had planned back around the end of World War II. A war that they had planned to create a drug culture in America so that dollars could be sent to Communist China to buy American war-making technology. Now, what is the solution? The Constitution of the United States reads in Article 3, Section 3, "Treason against the United States shall consist only in levying war against them, or," please notice, "or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. Notice that there are two ways to commit an act of treason: levying war against the United States or in giving aid and comfort to our enemies. Therefore, treason can mean giving aid and comfort to the enemy in Vietnam. Notice that the Founding Fathers carefully defined the word, and certain people have been tried and convicted for giving aid to Russia even after World War II was over. On March the 6th, 1951, a married couple named Ethel and Julius Rosenberg were charged with transferring secret information to Communist Russia on the construction of the atomic bomb. They were found guilty and executed on June the 19th, 1953. When their sentences were read to them, Judge Irving Kaufman told the Rosenbergs, "I consider your crime worse than murder. By your betrayal, you undoubtedly have altered the course of history to the disadvantage of our country. Millions of innocent people may pay the price of your treason." Notice that the judge called the passing of secrets on the atomic bomb a betrayal and treason. But the interesting thing about that trial and conviction is that it was not just the Rosenbergs who gave secrets about the atomic bomb to Communist Russia. This is a book written in 1980 by James Roosevelt, the second son of President Franklin Roosevelt. It is entitled A Family Matter. James was a major in the Army during World War II, and he was ordered by his father, the Commander-in-Chief of all armed forces, to turn over the plans, equipment, and the necessary components, including uranium, of an atomic bomb to Communist Russia in 1942. And James did as he was ordered. Now the question becomes, when were Franklin and his son James Roosevelt tried for treason and found guilty and executed? And your answer would be never, never, never. So certain politicians and military officers can get away with the betrayal of America and not be guilty of treason, because America was not at war with Communist Russia at the time. But neither were we when the Rosenbergs did the same thing. So both of these crimes were committed and found to be treason under the second definition of treason, giving aid and comfort to the enemy. On May the 15th, 1985, James Harper was tried and found guilty of selling missile secrets to communist agents. We were not at war with any communist nation in 1985. The judge called him a traitor and sentenced him to life and recommended he never be paroled. Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes on March the 25th, 1990, called the sale of secrets to the Soviet Union by John Walker, another who sold secrets to the Soviet Union, treason, treason, treason. Now, why is it wrong for the Rosenbergs and right for James and Franklin Roosevelt? Why is it wrong for James Harper and right for Presidents Johnson and Nixon? Why is it wrong for John Walker and right for the Congress of the United States? Simply stated, it is not right for anyone. It is not right for these individuals. It is not right for presidents. It is not right for Congress. Giving aid and comfort to Communist Russia during any time is defined by the Constitution as treason. The crime of treason can be prosecuted, and if the individuals are found guilty, they can be imprisoned. We can try congressmen, senators, businessmen, and members of the media who are still alive for the same crime we tried the Rosenbergs, James Harper, and John Walker for. Now, the next comment should explain exactly why these planners could sacrifice the lives of Americans in events that they had planned. They considered their goal to be of worldwide importance, and in their minds, this goal was worthy of the effort. So these people obviously believe in this philosophy: the end justifies the means. That means that if the goal is deemed to be worthwhile, any means to that goal becomes acceptable. Now, most religions take a contrary approach. The means used to reach the goal must be moral. Nikolai Lenin, the communist leader of the Russian Revolution in 1917, stated it this way: "We do not believe in eternal morality, such as thou shalt not murder. That is moral. That serves the destruction of the old society." It is obvious that these planners believed the same thing. If you were President of the United States and believed this, you could sink the Lusitania, plan Pearl Harbor, and stage a fake Gulf of Tonkin event to get to your goal. Yes, there are people who believe this, and some are in our government. Now, just before I close the discussion, I would like to make one additional point. We have examined the evidence that at least 3 times in America's past we have been the subject of attacks on our citizens and military forces. We have examined the evidence that our government planned each of these attacks in advance, and the purpose was to provoke us into a willingness to enter into a state of war against other nations. These 3 attacks were, of course, the Lusitania, Pearl Harbor, and the Gulf of Tonkin. I provided you with the evidence that our government had actively planned each of these attacks. Now, I would like to say something about the September 11th, 2001 attack on the World Trade Center, because it is my opinion and conclusion that this was the 4th such example of our government planning an attack against us or our military as an act to provoke us into a war. I believe that any fair viewing of the dozens of videos on the internet on the evidence that it was, as those who believe it was, our government that did this, as they call it, an inside job. It is known that America used this event as the reason to attack the Taliban in Afghanistan, but even more sinister, it is the fact that this event led to the war on terror, a massive attack on our freedoms and rights. May I suggest that after you complete your viewing of this video, you start a persistent viewing of all of the materials that are on the internet to convince you that 9/11 was indeed an inside job. Cicero, a Roman senator during the mighty Roman Empire that fell from within, warned the Romans about treason many centuries ago. He was quoted as saying, "A nation can survive its fools, even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within." The lesson is clear. America cannot survive treason from within. Some who are guilty of this treason are still alive. And I say, it is time to let the treason trials begin. And here is the reason why. Thank you so very much. And may God bless America.